Hello, everyone. Good evening. Tonight, I have a very special stream on the Suez Crisis. I'm very lucky to be joined for the first time on this channel by Charlemagne. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be invited to your channel.
Well, thank you. And yes, now the Suez Crisis, it's one of those, I think, monumentous occasions of the Cold War, and it's a topic I've wanted to discuss for quite a long time, ever since I really started my channel, and especially over the past year or so, as I've been delving a lot into the history of sort of the modern Middle East and the involvement of various great powers such as the British, the French, the Russians, and the Americans. And obviously, I've been doing a lot of work with my good friend Hunger, on the Chatham House essays, and just looking at how ultimately the British policy in the Middle East was so self-defeating in the long run, and Suez is really the crowning failure of that strategy. There is very much this idea, I think, as well with Suez, that I want to torpedo, that because the Americans put a lot of economic pressure on the British to essentially pull out of the crisis, that America, quote unquote, betrayed Britain. Again, I completely disagree with that. And as you go through in an article you recently did on Suez, which is why I asked you on, Charlie, is the whole thing was entirely of Britain's own self-defeat and her own fault ultimately.
Yeah, I agree with that summary. You could certainly accuse the Americans of putting undue pressure on the British. If you want to take that perspective, maybe the Americans could have simply allowed Great Britain to basically break with the new international order that had been set up under the United Nations. That said, the British had every reason not to expect that to happen. So, yeah, I agree. I think they're the architects of their own undoing. This isn't meant to play into this sort of ongoing internet dialogue about whether or not the Americans or British are at fault for the destruction of the British Empire. It's simply the perspective I had come away from. And in fact, when I started researching this crisis, it didn't really even have anything to do with that. I actually started getting interested in the Suez Crisis because of France, contemporary France, actually. And I was interested in Macron's position in some of the things he was saying in regard to Ukraine and ramping up French involvement. And it seemed to, buck the American and even wider European perspective on engagement in the war. So I was curious, is there a history in regard to France and sort of breaking with other Western allies and sort of pursuing an independent foreign policy? And it sort of led me back to the Suez Crisis, which is, I think, sort of the beginning of that break.
No, certainly. And also with Suez, you get a very interesting glimpse into the French-Israel connection, which is something I did delve into in a previous stream with Prudentialist on the legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but we'll get into that a bit later. So just to provide a brief summary of the Suez Crisis. So obviously what happens is a revolution in 1952, bringing in Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Free Officers Movement. They are a Egyptian pan-Arabic nationalist movement who are staunchly anti-imperialist. The crisis is ultimately a culmination of several belligerent moves Nasser would make against the British, and this would be in 1956, where in July he would pronounce the Egyptians were nationalizing the Suez Canal. This was actually in violation of a treaty he had signed with the British only in 1954. So in response to this, the British, French, and Israelis decide to invade Egypt, all with their own various different goals. All three of them, I think, wanted to depose Nasser. The British, because they saw him as an enemy who was just undermining their influence. The Israelis saw him as a dangerous existential threat to their country, while the French saw him as a threat via his support for Algerian independence, as the Algerian War of Independence was raging during the crisis. Though they all had their own goals outside of deposing Nasser, the British and French mostly wanted to keep the canal under their own control because they both were large shareholders in the company and wanted to keep the shipping lanes open. And also the Israelis, to a lesser extent, wanted that because at the time, their only access of water was through the Straits of Tiran, through the Red Sea. So having access to Suez would help them with their access to international trade. But outside of that brief summary, obviously the Israelis launched their invasion on the 29th of October. The British and French launched or declare a joint ultimatum the day after on the 30th, and then themselves officially go to war the day after and land paratroopers on Port Said on the 5th of November. And after taking the city, then what promulgates the actual withdrawal is Britain pulling out after the economic pressure that we've discussed previously. But after going over that brief summary, I just want to step back a bit and go over the sort of the wider background context of what led to this crisis happening, and why was it this particular band of allies, the British, the French, and the Israelis, against Egypt, and why did the Americans feel the need to apply pressure to de-escalate the situation? So to go back, we need to go really back about 100 years or so to the 19th century, where obviously you have the first modern leader of Egypt is Muhammad Ali Pasha, an Albanian who's made the governor of Egypt under the Ottomans. He's able to modernize and reform Egypt, and even though he's ultimately defeated in his grander ambitions to rule most of the Levant, he still was able to retain Egypt for himself and the governance of the country for his dynasty. So during the 19th century, ever since Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, the French have an increasing interest in the Middle East and in Egypt, part of the wider fascination with Orientalism, which I've discussed elsewhere on this channel. So the French invest and help the Egyptians build the Suez Canal. This is built in 1864, and with the Egyptians and the French being the prime stakeholders. And furthermore, after this period of about 10-15 years where the Egyptians see quite a bit of prosperity from the canal's construction, unfortunately, due to an economic depression in 1873 as part of the Vienna stock market crash, the Egyptian economy badly suffers, and the Khedive Ismail is forced to sell the 44% stake the Egyptian government has to the British. And later on, in 1882, you have a nationalist revolt under Colonel Urabi, and to put this down, the British invade in 1882 and basically turn Egypt into their own personal protectorate to secure the Suez Canal. However, the French and other European powers are still significant stakeholders within the canal itself. Though the British have invaded and set up the protectorate, Egypt is still nominally on paper part of the Ottoman Empire, but this is formally ended in 1914 when the British and Turks go to war in World War One. The protectorate formally comes to an end in 1922 after the Egyptian Revolution in 1919. This was largely caused by the pressure of a large amount of British troops in the country as a result of World War One, and also a lot of resentment against British mismanagement of the domestic Egyptian governance in the years during the war. If you want more information on that, I'd recommend you check out the Chatham House series of streams I'm doing with Hunger, because we do have a pair of streams where we look at the Egyptian Revolution in 1919 and its consequences. So furthermore, in 1922, Egypt's formal independence is declared. However, despite the independence, the Egyptian political system for the next 30 years is highly dysfunctional because the Edmund Allenby, the High Commissioner, essentially imposes a continental European style constitution on the country, and this essentially forces a very dysfunctional power sharing relationship between the king and the main two political factions, the liberal constitutionalists and the nationalist WAF party. So though the constitution allows for free and fair elections of universal suffrage, every time the king falls out with the party in government, which is for most of the time is the WAF party, he just dismisses them and appoints whoever he wants as the prime minister. And this ultimately leads to a lot of resentment towards this political system the British have imposed on Egypt. And I largely believe that British had done this to ensure that though Egypt was now nominally independent, it would ultimately be still subservient somewhat to British influence, not being able to exert a strong domestic sovereignty against them. Furthermore, the military situation, though, in terms was improving for the Egyptians, is as part of the Independence Treaty in 1922, the British, who had previously been allowed to occupy the whole country with military forces, were now only restricted to Sudan, which was a co-dominion from 1898, and also the Sinai and Suez itself, believing that this was sufficient to intervene in case of a revolution or other military threat. This is later revised in 1936, when the Egyptians essentially get a concession where the British now are only allowed to keep forces in Sudan or Suez itself and not in Sinai. And it also allows for the expansion of the Egyptian army. And so you see a large intake of new nationalist younger officers. And this is where we get the rise of the Free Officers movement led by Nasser and Nuguyib. So from this summary I've given, is there any sort of questions you had or anything you wanted to add, Charlie, at all? Or
I can add a bit to the end there. During the basically at the very end there, when the British were limited to the Suez Canal zone only, there was also a limitation placed on the number of personnel that could be placed, which was 10,000. This agitated the Egyptians because the British stationed far more than 10,000 troops in the Canal zone that they were limited to, and additionally, some of these limitations could have been avoided if the British had agreed to something Nasser desired, which is that the British were not in military uniform. So basically, he didn't want British uniformed soldiers walking around. The British military could be deployed, but not in uniform. And, this is probably for a propaganda win on his part in not having uniformed foreign soldiers on Egypt's territory. Now, of course, the British didn't agree to that as a matter of honor. I think that was probably the right move. I think you don't agree to something like that as a military, to take your soldiers out of uniform. But it's sort of interesting how these small things, something as simple as a man being in or not in a uniform, can lead to the crisis of such higher magnitude.
Oh, no, thank you for that point. And I guess it really lends itself to trying to understand the wider Arab or Egyptian mindset, because this is something John Baghdad explained a lot in his work. The Arabs as a people are very proud and they're very prone to insult. And if they're ever insulted, they want fanatic bloody revenge on whoever insults them. And I think I really understand fully why Nasser did this. It's totally in line with the Arab mindset. But sort of moving on from there, ultimately around this time, because it's very interesting looking at how Egypt ended up becoming this leading nation of what is quote-unquote pan-Arabism, because prior to the rise of the Free Officers movement, I mentioned the WAF party, in terms of Egyptian identity, it was largely Egyptian nationalism, so Egypt should just be an independent sovereign country. And what's more interesting is that in terms of understanding the desire to spread influence abroad, it was largely limited to the intrigues of kings Fawad and his son Farouk, who were looking at potentially reviving the Islamic Caliphate. And then when that proved abortive, Farouk would then indulge pan-Arabism ultimately. And in 1945, the British government, namely Anthony Eden, who was the Prime Minister during the Suez Crisis, who at this time was Foreign Secretary under Churchill, one of his pet projects was creation of an Arab League. So this is all the different Arab powers in this one big confederation. So you've got the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Jordanians, and the Iraqis. And what's interesting was Egypt's inclusion, because though people do view Egypt as an Arab country, Pan-Arabism up until that point had largely been a Levantine and Mesopotamian endeavor. And with Egypt's inclusion, it ends up in sort of investing Egypt with this ambition to become the leader of the Arabs ultimately. And obviously from there, obviously in 1946, Britain gives up trying to maintain a mandate in Palestine after repeated Israeli terror attacks on British soldiers and officials. And so this leads to the intervening 2 years where the United Nations ends up choosing to partition Palestine. into two states. This leads to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and ultimately what's interesting is Egypt's involvement in that war on the side of the Arabs, along with the Lebanese, Syrians, Jordanians, and the Iraqis against Israel, was largely at the King Farouk's initiative, because again there was this consciousness of wanting to be seen to be the strong sovereign leader of the Arabs, and that was largely the reason for their involvement. And it's also interesting when we go back to the Free Officers League, because that war was the first time that a lot of those officers saw combat, and very famously Nasser himself led troops on the front line and was actually commanded a holdout against the Israelis that was in Palestine that lasted right up until the 1949 ceasefire. So you can certainly say that this war, I think, radicalized a lot of Egyptians, and especially the Free Officers League, to what would happen later. But sort of going into this a bit more, I now want to do a bit of reading from Glubb in his book Britain and the Arabs. So in this passage, he's sort of describing the initial lead up to the 1952 Egyptian revolution that would bring the Free Officers League to power. So, as I've already so frequently emphasised, Britain's chief interest in Egypt since the end of the First World War was to find some method to ensure that the Suez Canal would always be open. The other so-called reserved points, the future of the Sudan and the safety of foreigners, were merely incidental and not themselves vital British interests. In 1945, Britain had hoped to reach an agreement with the Arab League as a whole, but the bitterness aroused by the creation of Israel had destroyed all prospect of success. In October 1951, a fresh attempt was made to reach a settlement. The United States, Britain, France, and Turkey issued a full-power statement on the creation of a Middle East command. The objects of the proposal were said to be, firstly, to create a joint staff which would plan the defence of the area. Secondly, it was hoped to assist member states with advice, training, arms, and equipment. It being recognised that although the Supreme Headquarters would prepare plans for the defence, the armies of member states need not be placed under their command in peacetime. It was emphasised that the national sovereignty of the member states would be respected, and that the headquarters staff would be an integrated Allied command. That is to say, that officers of all the member countries would be appointed to it. It was added that, although the Western powers would necessarily play a leading role, at the beginning, the tendency as time went on would be for the Middle East countries to play an increasing part and for the Western powers gradually to reduce their commitments. Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa issued statements in the United Nations pledging their support. On the 8th of October 1951, the Egyptian government, aware of their proposals about to be submitted to it, issued a unilateral abrogation of the 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, presumably in order to create such an atmosphere as to render agreement on the four-power proposals impossible. The four-power plan was presented to the Egyptian Foreign Minister on the 13th of October 1951, and he was also informed that the British base would be immediately handed over to the Joint Allied Command, and that Egypt was invited to become a member of that command on terms of equality with the sponsoring powers. The British government, at the same time, offered proposals for the settlement of the Sudan. It was suggested that an international commission be appointed to preside over development in the Sudan, that Egypt receive an international guarantee ensuring her rights in the waters of the Nile, and that a date be agreed upon for the achievement of self-government by the Sudanese. Should they later decide to unite themselves to Egypt, the British government pledged itself to place no obstacle in their way. There can be no doubt that these proposals represented a very genuine attempt by the Western powers, and particularly by Britain, to find a permanent solution to the Egyptian problem. The organisation proposed was similar to that which, at the same time, was being set up by the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation in Europe, and on which officers from all NATO member states, whether great or small, were serving together. Egyptian nationalism, however, was too sensitive for such a suggestion to be palatable. The Egyptians had smarted too long under a sense of inferiority. Their proposals meant that foreign troops, even if formed of various allied contingents with which the Egyptian army would operate on terms of equality, would remain on Egyptian soil. It was true that allied troops were already stationed in a similar manner in Germany, France, and Britain, but the Egyptians felt that, in their case at least, the continued presence of such troops would limit their independence. There would seem to be little doubt that such organisations, drawing more and more nations together on terms of equality to defend common interests, even limiting the sovereignty of member states, whether great or small, must be the best hope for peace and progress in the future. Moreover, the Suez Canal is an international highway in which all nations in Western Europe and the Indian Ocean are interested. It was perhaps regrettable that India and Pakistan could not also have been represented on the four-power plan. So, from there, we're sort of seeing what would be the origin of the Baghdad Pact, which was the essentially later become known as CENTO, or the Central Treaty Organization, or MITO, Middle East Treaty Organization. Essentially, it was a Middle East copy of NATO, and this is sort of the origins of that. The British and Western allies were hoping to use this as a bulwark against the Soviet Union and their expansion of influence into the Middle East. And part of the failure, I think, of the Baghdad Pact was the failure to get Egypt and most of the Arab nations to go along with it. And largely, as Glob's gone into there, the main opposition was the presence of foreign troops, even if they weren't just British troops on their soil. Is there any sort of comment you wanted to add to that at all? Or
No, I was actually going to ask you to talk about the Baghdad Pact because, yeah, this is something that Nasser viewed as basically undermining Egyptian influence in the Arab world, which is partly why he decided not to join it, in addition to the problem of having foreign troops stationed on your soil. I guess to lay this out geographically, the Baghdad Pact is basically all of the Arab countries from Turkey to Pakistan bordering either the Soviet Union, we can say, and its satellite states, and then the Arab League, which Egypt was a part of, was basically all of North Africa and the Saudi Arabian Peninsula.
thank you. And
I see. Yeah, you brought it up. Okay, good.
But what's important to remember is that in terms of Arab, the only real Arab country that's a member is Baghdad, and that's where it got the name from the Baghdad Pact. Because
Right.
Something that's really important to understand with the Middle East is at the time in Pan-Arabism, the really two leading nations are the Egyptians and the Iraqis. Iraq had been set up as a kingdom as part of the Sykes-Picot carve-up between the British and the French, and essentially Iraq was you're giving essentially it was a fig leaf partially to the Hashemites, because Faisal, who during the Arab Revolt had hoped to be the leader of this new revived caliphate in Syria and Iraq, because the French kick him out of Syria, he's had to make do with just Iraq, and so you essentially have got this pan-Arab government that's ruling only part of the Arab world, and the Iraqis are obsessed with this. And the main sort of leader, because Faisal would die in 1934, and then his son Ghazi would come in but he himself, Ghazi, would then die in 1939 in a car crash, leaving his infant son Faisal II as king. And so for most of the Kingdom of Iraq's history, it was actually ruled over by the ever-present Prime Minister, Nouri al-Said. And Said's fascinating because he's sort of like an anti-Nasser, whereas Nasser saw Pan-Arabism as anti-imperialist, trying to drive Western influence out of the Arab world and trying to make it independent and sovereign. One key difference is that Nouri al-Said was a staunch anti-communist. He believed that Soviet influence in the Arab world would be a disaster and would subvert the various governments, which is especially important. Remember that Iraq and Jordan are both ruled by Hashemite monarchs, and so obviously communism is not exactly well disposed towards monarchy. So there is you can almost say there's a conservative or reactionary opposition in the Arab world to Soviet influence, whereas the Nasserism, or the Nasserist flavor of Pan-Arabism, is much more radical and revolutionary.
Yeah, so you can see how this caused a problem for Nasser because Iraq, being the Arab state in CENTO, or the Baghdad Pact, was also in the Arab League and had a very different perspective than Egypt and Nasser, whereas Nasser was, we can describe him as somewhat socialist, I suppose. And he, as we know, he did an arms deal with Czechoslovakia, effectively just the Soviet Union, right, through Czechoslovakia. So Nasser didn't have a problem with taking arms or support from the Soviet Union. In fact, Egypt was the first state, I believe, first non-communist state that the Soviet Union did any such arms deal with. So this was an important step as well, and partially why the Western powers reacted strongly against what was going on in Egypt as well, because this was sort of breaching new territory in terms of the Soviet Union now providing arms outside of its direct domain of influence.
Certainly. And one other aspect of the Baghdad Pact I want to go over, especially why I think Nasser would be opposed to it, is remember one of the core states is Iran, who in 1953 there was a joint British-American coup to oust the left-leaning nationalist premiership of Mohammad Mossadegh, who had threatened to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian oil company. And obviously that was largely pulled off as a result of MI6 and the CIA. And ultimately, so you can think about it, you can see why Nasser would have opposition to a alliance that contains a state such as Iran. It's almost like, you know, this alliance is just for these Western puppet governments, and that this isn't really an alliance of sovereign nations.
Right. So that although Nasser got betrayed at the time as a sort of Mussolini or Hitler type figure, you can see how his perspective resulted in genuine concerns about his own country's sovereignty, given what was going on in all of the neighboring states, and also the fact that the British presence in Egypt, which had gone on for nearly a century at that point, was always supposed to be a temporary occupation, and it simply was not. Right? They were just from the Egyptians' perspective. The British were never going to leave, and were basically going to occupy the country indefinitely.
No, and just a couple of points I want to address that you brought up there. Firstly, about the idea of Nasser being some kind of Egyptian Hitler or Mussolini, but later on during the actual crisis, there was a letter that Eden wrote to Eisenhower to justify British intervention, and I quote, I shit you not, Eden actually uses the terms Nasser is a Muslim Mussolini, and we have to take him down for this. So it's really depressing that Eden is just pretty much copying almost exactly the British policy during World War II and just applying it to Egypt. So we can't tolerate these nationalist, quote unquote, fascist governments that we don't agree with. They have to be totally destroyed. We can't sort of come to any deals with them. And also, you have a point about Arab socialism. I personally think that Arab socialism is not really genuine. I think it's more an invention that Arab nationalists use to kind of assuage Soviet concerns that they're dealing with quote unquote nationalists.
Yeah, I was thinking of counterfactuals here too. We could imagine that if World War II had gone in a different direction and the Soviet Union had lost and Germany had won, we would probably have seen the Arab states, such as Egypt, using the same tactic against the National Socialist or Fascist. They would have called themselves, whatever they needed to call themselves in order to make whatever deals they felt were necessary for their own sovereignty. So, I was just kind of entertaining that counterfactual, and I agree with you there. Also, on the point about that letter that Eden sent to, I think this is the first time we've actually mentioned Eden. So he was the prime minister during the Suez Crisis and sort of the main instigator of events from the British side. He was also the foreign secretary under Winston Churchill, who was prime minister again just a few years, possibly even less than a year before the crisis, actually. I don't remember the dates exactly, but
Eden comes in 55. So Eden actually serves 3 stints as foreign secretary. The first time under Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, and he actually resigns in 1938 over the Munich Agreement. Then he comes back in Churchill's wartime government, and then again he comes back as foreign secretary after the Tories are returned to power in 51, and then comes in as prime minister. Well, ultimately, one thing you have to understand is that Eden is essentially Churchill's protege. He was very much groomed for office to succeed Churchill.
Right, that's exactly what I was trying to get at, is that Eden is highly influenced by all the events of World War II and Churchill in particular, and he's basically inherited that exact perspective. Now, one thing that was odd I found, and I uncovered this in the essay I wrote, is that Churchill seemed to be playing this interesting game towards the end of his last stint as prime minister, where he was. It seems like he was secretly for intervention in Suez, but was playing the part of being against it. My theory is that so that Eden would sort of have a sort of justification for flipping to the other side for intervention publicly. I'm not sure. What do you know anything about this history? Because from what I read, it didn't really go into Churchill's perspective on this, or why he would have been sort of playing this inside baseball among his own cabinet.
The only thing I can think of possibly is that he was trying to strengthen Eden, and by essentially, Eden's coming across with this novel scheme, I think. Because remember, the whole Arab League was very much the pet project of Eden and British, because the Arab League wasn't just going to be a confederation of all different Arab states. I went over this again with those streams of Prudentialists, but one of the British point men on the ground in the Middle East during World War II was Edward Louis Spears, who was actually a close friend of Churchill's. He'd originally served as the British government's official representative to the Charles de Gaulle and the Free French before serving as a consul general in Beirut in the latter years of the war. And Louis Spears was essentially, as the British were kicking the French out, they were striking up all these various trade and military deals with the Syrians and the Lebanese. And so ultimately you can see that obviously you've got to remember as well that after the war, obviously during the British Empire, India was the jewel in the crown, the most important colony. Now now India's independent. You could almost say that Britain's crown jewel is now the Middle East, because remember, they've got the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in Iran. They've got the Iraqi Petroleum Company in Iraq. They've got Jordan as effectively a puppet state, though Jordan is effectively independent from 1946, but still the military is controlled by Glubb and has got British officers. They still have the Suez Canal. So ultimately, though they've lost India and they've definitely taken some damage following the war, the Middle East is the best hopes for Britain to have any kind of imperial presence in the world. And so I can almost see Churchill as sort of trying to big up Eden to try and help him ensure that his chosen successor succeeds him.
Yeah, that seems to be what was going on. Let me just read this quote, actually, just to highlight what I was talking about. So this is from an essay by Julian Amory, who is an MP. He was one of the founders of what's called the Suez Group, which was a group of MPs that were informally part of this association we call the Suez Group. And basically what that means is they were against the British pulling out of Egypt and its nearby satellites. So Amory says, quote, "The question of the Suez base led to a very serious difference between Churchill, still Prime Minister, and Eden. One morning, after I had made a strong and perhaps excessive attack on Eden in the House of Commons, I received a call from number 10 Downing Street. One of the Prime Minister's secretaries was on the line. I expected to be ticked off for what I had said. Instead, the private secretary said, 'Sir Winston asked me to tell you that he has read your speech and very much agrees with you.' There were to be 2 or 3 subsequent occasions while Eden was pressing the case for withdrawal when Churchill encouraged me to keep up a protest against it." So this is really weird, where Eden is basically the foreign secretary at this point, and he's for withdrawal, which is what happened, right? And Amory, part of the Suez Group, is attacking him for it. Meanwhile, Churchill, their actual prime minister, is on face on Eden's side, but behind the scenes actually encouraging attacks on his own government from within his own party. So this is very odd and devious. But I think you explained it fairly well.
Oh, no, thank you for that quote there. And so in terms of obviously we've gone over the Baghdad Pact and Nasser's concerns over that, but I just want to go back a bit because I want to actually go over the 1952 revolution in Egypt that brings Nasser and Naguib to power. So for this, there is actually another reading from Glubb that I want to do. I'm just going to pull this up. At one moment.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay. Right, so on the 16th of October 1951, the day after the excited scenes in the Egyptian parliament already described, disorders broke out in Ismailia and Port Said on the 25th of October. The Egyptian civilian labour was withdrawn from the Canal zone. On the 6th of November 1951, the British government addressed a note to the Egyptian government pointing out that the unilateral abrogation of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty was illegal and that all the international treaties would be rendered valueless if unilateral abrogation was to be accepted as valid. On the 26th of January 1952, mass rioting and incendiarism broke out in Cairo as a reaction to events on the Canal. Savage crowds looted and set fire at first to foreign shops, but ultimately to Egyptian premises also. Shepherd's Hotel, Barclays Bank, Thomas Cook's travel agency, the Turf Club, the Egyptian Royal Automobile Club, and the Swedish and Lebanese consulates were among the prominent buildings sacked and burnt down. 10 cinemas were also reported to have been gutted. 60 people were reported as killed, including 12 British. The Cairo police made little or no attempt to disperse the crowds. The same evening, martial law was declared. The riots had obviously been carefully prepared in advance, and communists were reported to have been the organisers. Several bodies of persons done to death by the crowds were reported to have been burnt, while others' corpses were alleged to have been mutilated by the mobs of frenzied people. The same evening, King Farouk dismissed the Prime Minister, Nahas Pasha, and called upon Ali Mahir Pasha to form a national government of all parties. Tension was relaxed as a result of Ali Mahir Pasha's assumption of office. 6 months later, on the 26th of July 1952, a force of Egyptian troops surrounded the royal palace in Alexandria and obliged King Farouk to sign an immediate abdication, the army having seized power in Cairo 3 days earlier. This military coup d'etat was led by an Egyptian army officer, Mohammed Naguib, who set up a military government. On the 9th of September 1952, all political parties were ordered to submit their programmes for government scrutiny. Mustafa Pasha Nahas was placed on trial and was accused of being a faithful servant of imperialism. By the way, I will say I think that's totally laughable because Nahas was the leader of the Wafd party, the Egyptian nationalists, and during the Egyptian Revolution in 1919, the Wafd party's leader, Zaghloul Pasha, literally had like violent mobs attack and harass the British. They actually had a literal assassination squad that would murder British officers, and they even killed the British Governor General of Sudan. So just hearing that Nasser and these three officers called the Wafd Party serves imperialism is just laughable in the long stream of things. But back to the text anyway. So on the 15th of October 1952, the Egyptian Minister of Commerce announced the formation of a Suez Canal department to study the operation of the canal with a view to taking it over in 1969, when the concession made to the Suez Canal Company was due to expire. Although a reassuring statement was issued at the same time, stating that Egypt would not take over prior to that date, there seems to be little doubt that the military government was already preparing to seize the canal. It seems curious that 4 years later, the Western powers were completely taken by surprise. Meanwhile, a conflict was already developing in the group of army officers who had engineered the coup d'etat. Mohammed Naguib was 51 years old. The majority of his collaborators were in their 30s. Naguib seems to have been a more simple and straightforward character than his associates, a man genuinely desirous of giving freedom to the Egyptian people. His denunciations of Britain were violent. He mingled freely with the public and enjoyed considerable popularity. Gamal Abdel Nasser and the younger members of the Council of the Revolution held other views. As a result of these differences, Mohammed Naguib agreed to resign on 25th of February 1954, 19 months after the coup d'etat. The public, however, were more deeply attached to him than the younger members. Violent street demonstrations followed, with the result that Naguib was reinstated on the 28th of February. On the 8th of March, he was declared to be in supreme power, Prime Minister and Chairman of the Council of the Revolution. On the 25th of March, the Council of Revolution announced that free elections would take place on the 18th of June. That on the 24th of July, the Council of Revolution would surrender power to an elected constituent assembly, and that the revolutionary leaders would return to their military duties. These liberal measures were instigated by Mohammed Naguib, but were violently opposed in the council by Gamal Abdel Nasser. King Saud happened at that time to be on visit to Egypt and attempted to mediate between the two parties. On the 29th of March, further street disturbances took place and the tension approached breaking point. Mohammed Naguib collapsed at the airport while saying goodbye to King Saud. An older man than his rivals, the struggle and suspense had been more than he could bear. The very same day, the remaining members of the Council of the Revolution, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced that the election of a constituent assembly would be postponed for 3 years. On the 17th of April 1954, Mohammed Naguib resigned his position as Prime Minister and was succeeded by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Immediately, the process of abolishing political parties and liquidating opponents was set on foot, to the accompaniment of censorship of the press. Mohammed Naguib, however, remained nominally president until the 14th of November 1954, when he was dismissed by a decision of the cabinet and the council of the revolution. He was placed under house arrest in a villa 8 miles from Cairo. A month later, the Muslim Brotherhood, a religious fraternity counting millions of members, was suppressed. 6 leaders of the organisation were tried on the charge of plotting to put Naguib in power and to restore parliamentary government, 5 of them being sentenced to death. Having thereby frightened the opposition to silence, Gamal Abdel Nasser was free to carry out his own policy. So from there, we can see that 1952 was a very bloody year in Egyptian politics, and you can certainly see that though the three officers were, broadly speaking, one faction, they were obviously not entirely in agreement. And what's fascinating is it was almost like Naguib was this sort of more moderate father figure who I think you could say was clearly an Egyptian patriot, but was obviously not as radical as these younger officers led by Nasser, who then who took power from him. Is there any comment you want to add off the back of that at all?
Or not in particular. I'm not too familiar with the revolution itself. I guess we can say the Western powers might view this as a sort of socialist revolution given subsequent events, but that's not at all what happened. It's really more of a nationalist revolution against the monarchy, which won't remove the foreign powers from Egyptian soil.
No, thank you. But it's interesting just to go back to this idea of Egypt flirting with well, obviously this idea in the alternate history where Nasser might oppose the National Socialist to Germans. Well, another aspect of this, I think that's worth looking at, is the idea that the king was somehow like a servant of imperialism and wasn't a true patriot. I find it rather questionable because during the war, actually, Ali Mahir, who was mentioned, who was the last prime minister before the revolution happened, he was a close ally of King Farouk. And actually, during the war, King Farouk tried to take Egypt down a very neutral course, even though the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty gave the British the right to military use Egypt as a base in the event of war. And obviously, there was the Battle of El Alamein and others on Egyptian territory. But the British were very concerned because in 1941, during the height of the war, there was a pro-Axis coup in Iraq. And obviously, the British massively cracked down on that and restore order in Iraq and restore Nouri al-Sayyid to power. And then from there, they were able to, with the support of the Free French, drive the Vichy French out of the Levant and Lebanon and Syria. But obviously, you could see why because later on, in 1942, the British would effectively no longer be able to tolerate Ali Mahir because he was very pro-German, and the British actually surround the royal palace in the Aberdeen Palace incident and force the king at gunpoint to dismiss Ali Mahir and put the Wafd Party back in power. So you can see that there was this almost a history of this sort of quote-unquote nationalist Arab military figures staging coups in loyal British protectorates and the British having to crack down to restore their authority. So you can see why they was very much concerned about Nasser. But it also just shows to show how much British power had declined, because in 1941 there was total retribution against the Iraqis because the British responded straight away. Well, obviously the military situation demanded it because at that time the Americans hadn't joined the war yet, and the Germans had only just invaded the Soviets. Whereas now we're looking at post-war where Britain's position vis-a-vis the other great powers is significantly diminished. Is there anything extra you want to add to that, or?
No. We can move on, I think.
Oh, no, certainly. Okay. And then obviously now we've had the revolution come in and Nasser has supplanted Naguib as the leader of Egypt. There's essentially a series of negotiations that go on between the British and Nasser over the Canal, which does culminate in a treaty in 1954. And I've got some more reading from Glub I want to do. Let's bring the page up. Okay, so on the 27th of April 1953, negotiations were opened between Egypt and Britain on the subject of the Canal Zone. On the 6th of May, however, the proceedings were adjourned owing to the inability of the two parties to agree. Mohammed Nagoyeb, then still in power, violently denounced Britain as an enemy of his country. A number of terrorist incidents in the zone resulted. Negotiations were not resumed until the 30th of July 1954, when Mohammed Nagoyeb, though still president, had lost nearly all authority. The principle of an early British evacuation of the base were conceded. The two principal obstacles to agreement were the condition under which Britain could reactivate the base and whether the technicians who were to maintain it should wear military uniforms. Britain regarded the Middle East as a single military area and desired to retain the power to reoccupy the base in the event of an attack on Persia or Turkey. Egypt, interested only in the Arab League states, wished a British reoccupation of the base to be conditional on an attack on another Arab state. An agreement was eventually initialed on the 27th of July 1954. It provided for a complete withdrawal of all British forces within 20 months. It recognised that the Canal was both a part of Egypt and a waterway of international importance. Both countries agreed to uphold the 1888 international agreement providing for free navigation. Egypt was to be responsible for security in the base, but the equipment was to be maintained by British civilian contractors. The British House of Commons approved of the agreement by 257 votes to 26, the opposition votes being the so-called Suez group of Conservatives. The Labour Party abstained. Supporting the motion, Mr. Head, the British Secretary of State for War, claimed that the existence of nuclear weapons made a smaller base adequate. Moreover, the two divisions at the time, stationed in the Canal Zone, would be a valuable addition to the strategic reserve in Britain. We aim at cooperation with Egypt, Mr. Head said. In Cairo, Gamal Abdel Nasser was even more conciliatory. A new era of friendly relations based on trust, confidence and cooperation opens between Egypt and Britain and the Western countries. Whatever may have first been the errors committed by the British government after the First World War, there can be no doubt that at the end of the Second, its only object was to secure Arab friendship. Britain sought to Arab cooperation owing to the importance of the east to west corridor, which passed through their territory. She was apprehensive lest this passage be dominated by a potentially hostile power, which could threaten to close this vital international highway. There need surely be here no clash between Britain and Arab nationalism, for the former no longer desired to dominate. A free Arab group would keep the passageway open more efficiently if it were strong than if it were weak, divided, or chaotic. Why were these glowing hopes of Anglo-Egyptian cooperation so soon to be disappointed? We are not yet in a position to determine why Gamal Abdel Nasser did not endeavour to promote that new era of friendly cooperation with Britain, which he himself had foretold. For although amicable relations were maintained in Egypt itself, at least until the evacuation of the British troops were completed, Egyptian broadcasting stations continued to pour out streams of abuse and propaganda against Britain and to incite all the surrounding countries against her. These activities were not even limited to Arab countries, for Egypt began to broadcast to Africa in Swahili to encourage disturbances in Kenya and to contact the terrorists in Cyprus. It is difficult to place ourselves in the psychological atmosphere of Egypt and even more inside the mind of Colonel Nasser. The Egyptians had been ruled by foreigners for centuries, and now, for the first time, all foreign troops were to be withdrawn. Previous khedives, kings, and governments had striven in vain to achieve this end, but at last it had been accomplished, and Gamal Abdel Nasser was the principal engineer of this triumph. The victory had not been won by force but by skill, for the Egyptians had persuaded the British that if they withdrew from the Canal Zone, a new era of friendship would open and traffic through the canal would be secure. So, resounding a victory might well cause Colonel Nasser to be elated. Perhaps also he was genuinely inspired with hatred for Britain, but such a sentiment, if indeed he felt it, would scarcely suffice to account for his subsequent actions. Most likely the explanation would appear to be that, hailed as a hero of his country, he allowed his judgment to be disturbed by new and dazzling ambitions. Having driven the British from Egypt, as he claimed, he had the vision of himself as a hero of the Middle East and everywhere driving out the imperialists, and himself, of course, taking their place as a new pharaoh. Meanwhile, however, his own position even in Egypt was by no means secure, but his prestige at home would be greatly strengthened if he were hailed as a hero abroad. Having thus selected the role of a liberator from imperialism as the basis of his career, he found himself led on to attack British policy in every other neighbouring country. Perhaps also he did not anticipate any serious reaction. The Egyptians had been abusing the British for 30 years without any unfortunate results. The Syrian dictator Adib al-Shawakli had done the same. It may have been, however, that the British regarded it as a legitimate politics for a man to oppose them in his own country, but they resented Egyptian attempts to intervene in other countries, even with nations completely unconnected with Egypt or with Arabs. Suffice it at least to say that the prospect of amicable Egyptian relations, which seems to Bright in July 1954 was spurred not by an attempt by Britain to injure or dominate Egypt, but by the latter's increasing attempts to raise trouble for the British in Arab countries. It may be indeed be argued that the destruction of Britain's influence in the Middle East would promote Arab unity under Egyptian leadership. There is no reason to imagine that Arab unity need have been injurious to British interests. Indeed, by helping to form the Arab League in 1945, Britain had actually endeavoured to promote it. The evacuation of Palestine and the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, however, led to a great intensification of xenophobia, fanaticism, and hostility to the West. Events took charge of the situation rather than policy. The impression was allowed to gain ground that Britain was actively opposed to Arab unity. The British government, with its fatal lack of sensitivity to the trends of popular opinion in other countries, did nothing to eradicate this impression. Perhaps, however, the real explanation lies in some psychological characteristic of fanaticism. The economic interests of Egypt bounded to the West. Now that all foreign troops had left Egyptian soil, friendship and cooperation with the West would have been for Egypt the prudent course, for that very reason unpalatable. For there is in fanaticism a positive joy in unreasonable, even outrageous behaviour, and exhilaration in saying things about enemies which are obviously untrue. So from there we can see that with the treaty that was negotiated between the British and Egyptians, I think that was entirely reasonable agreement between two powers. And in Glubb's view, Nasser was just this radical opportunist who was taking advantage of British goodwill. I mean, what's your view on all that, essentially?
I think Glubb's assessment of Nasser is good. Nasser certainly viewed himself as the sort of prospective leader of the Arab world, and it's understandable given what Glubb described about Egypt involving itself in countries outside of Egypt and causing problems for the British. I think I can see why the British would start getting seriously fed up with him to the point where, Eden eventually wanted him completely removed from power. So I think Glubb assessments is accurate as far now, to the extent that towards the end he sort of regarded Nasser as a bit perhaps more cynical than Nasser may have actually been. It's kind of hard to really get insight there, but he sort of suggests that Nasser is just using the British goodwill to just keep taking advantage of them. I'm not so sure that that's true. I think Nasser was simply influenced by, as Glubb pointed out, whatever opportunities presented themselves that would allow him to solidify himself as leader of the revolution. It makes sense why, from the British perspective, they would see him as only being interested in undermining the British. But I think he could have worked with the British so long as whatever deals they made did actually secure his position in Egypt and the Arab world. And, from the British perspective, we could see how those things would always look like the intention being to undermine the British. But this is really, I think, more of a side effect of Nasser's actions than the intent. I mean, I don't think Nasser was hell-bent on reducing British influence. It was really only about increasing his own, and that coincided with a reduction in British influence, but it didn't necessarily have to.
Well, thank you for that assessment. And something we need to address is Glubb, I think, has a very personal reason to not like Nasser. Just to elaborate, because he obviously mentions the 1948 Arab-Israeli War there, because there's several points we can go off. So essentially, one of the rallying cries of pan-Arabism and Nasser opposition to the British was this idea that Britain was this pro-Zionist power that created the State of Israel, and the State of Israel is this total anathema to Arab nationalism, because by imposing this Jewish state on Arab land, this was a slap in the face which the Arabs couldn't accept, and that is very much true to an extent. Yes, you did have the Balfour Declaration in World War One, but I have a much more cynical view of that. I believe that ultimately what the government was trying to do there was to secure American support for Britain establishing a mandate over Palestine, because the main strategic benefit to doing so was because Britain wanted a more secure position in the Middle East to shore up their position in Egypt, which was still a protectorate back then, because they wanted a link between Egypt and the new other mandates of Jordan and Iraq. And ultimately, with people like Glubb, I think the British elite were much more sympathetic to the Arabs than some would tell you, or the Arabs would even admit to. for reasons of pride. And to go over more why I think Glubb personally is perhaps a bit overly critical of Nasser is he mentions then that Nasser is publishing all of this propaganda. So there was these radios that are propagandizing Arab nationalist news into Jordan, into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon. And remember, Jordan and Iraq are the two most closely aligned Arab powers to the British in the Middle East. And the Jordan army, or at the time the Arab Legion, is literally controlled by British officers, in Jordanian service. And Glubb is the leader of the Arab Legion from 1939 until 1956. And what would serve as a real catalyst for Suez is in 1956, in May 1956, so a couple of months before Nasser announces the nationalization of the Canal, there is a series of blows to British influence in Jordan. We were mentioning the Baghdad Pact earlier. Well, the British want Jordan in the Baghdad Pact alongside the other Hashemite kingdom in Iraq. However, the King Hussein is against this. Now, he personally was conscious and wanted to maintain good relations with Britain, but the situation in Jordan was becoming quite unstable. A lot of his subjects, especially because at the time Jordan had actually annexed the West Bank to prevent its fall into the hands of the Israelis, and 2/3 of Jordan's population were in the West Bank and were Palestinians, and they were much more radicalized towards the Israelis than your average Jordanian was, and he had to bear their opinions in mind. And simply put, there was a lot actually of disturbance and riots in Jordan in 1956 in support of Nasser and driving out British influence. And so the king, in order to try and stabilize the country, has to make some concessions, including not joining the Baghdad Pact, even though he'd actually wanted to. And furthermore, from this, what doesn't help is that he has certain Arab nationalist officers whispering in his ear, Grimble Wormtongue style, agitating against the presence of British officers, including Glubb. And it's actually one of these officers which Glubb blames for his own dismissal, because around this time in May 1956, the King Hussein, almost on a whim, dismisses all the British officers and effectively executes, you could almost say, a nationalization of the Jordan army. It's transitioned from the Arab Legion into the Royal Army of Jordan, and the removal of all these British officers in their pretty rapid exile. And so again, I also see this as a concession to the pan-Arab forces in the country. And I also think this personally emboldens Nasser to lead up to the nationalization of the Canal, because if you see it from Nasser's perspective, firstly, the revolution succeeds in 52, then he succeeds in taking power from the Guyab, then he succeeds in getting the British to admit to withdrawing military from Egypt within 20 months and an eventual withdrawal from the Canal. Now he's driven them out of Jordan. So you can see he's constantly stacking up all these wins. So you can see why I think he then felt bold enough to then go forward and push forward with an early nationalization. And you can also, again, explain why Glubb, I think, had a personal dislike, and perhaps why we could see British concerns to Nasser's endeavours and his actions. So if you want to come back to that with at all, or...
Well, it really demonstrates that there's a confluence of events all happening at the same time that are leading us to the crisis, both in terms of establishing Britain's perspective on how to react with this string of defeats or humiliations or loss of influence in the Arab world, as well as from Nasser's perspective as well, the sort of unreliability of agreements with Western powers. Now, another thing going on at this time is we haven't really talked about the American involvement as well, but the Americans are concerned with the conflicts you're bringing up as well, and Nasser's influence. There were these operations, they were called Operation Alpha, and then there was another called Operation Omega that was basically meant to deal with Nasser's growing influence in the Middle East, because, Omega is actually a like a memorandum that Dulles created for Eisenhower. It was basically a policy description, which had to do with reducing Nasser's influence in the Middle East because they saw him leaning towards the Soviet Union. Eventually, the British sort of try and convince Dulles and Eisenhower to fund this dam project. I don't know if you want to, if now is the time to actually get to that, but there's a lot of clandestine action happening on the part of the Americans as well in trying to deal with this problem, because the Americans are also concerned with what's happening between the Arabs and the British, and they don't necessarily want to see British influence destroyed, especially because it's going, from their perspective, likely to be replaced by Soviet influence. So sort of ties to the idea that the Americans would want to just destroy British influence in the Middle East is very counterproductive to the aims they both explicitly and clandestinely had at the time. So anyway.
Oh, no, thank you for that. Yes, I think now is a good time to go over the perhaps American-British relations in perspective of this leading up to the crisis. And so the first thing is, like, when you say Dulles, which one, sorry, do you mean John Foster Dulles?
Oh, Foster,
or do you mean Alan?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just for clarification of the audience. So in 1953, you obviously had the Eisenhower administration come in, and there were two brothers. There's John Foster Dulles, who's made the Secretary of State, and then you have his younger brother, Alan Dulles, who's made the director of the CIA, and then they're both important figures within Eisenhower's administration. Obviously, when we mentioned the coup in Iran before, Alan Dulles is one of the architects of that coup. And again, just to buttress your point about undermining British influence as being counterproductive, well, the Americans helped the British out in Iran in 1953 with that coup. And the one thing I would say is I do feel with the Iranian coup, I do think that there was also, not only is it British interests, there's also American ones, because ultimately there was concerns that Mossadegh's government were going to go over to the Soviets, and so that's one reason. But another reason that's not really talked about very much is the Americans feared that if they allowed a nationalist government to take part in a Middle Eastern country, especially one that wants to nationalize oil assets, that was a big no-no to the Americans, because around this time, well, actually just before and during the war, Roosevelt establishes a treaty of friendship with the Saudis. This is where you get the American-Saudi Arabia relationship start. But one of the benefits of that is you get the setup of Aramco, or the Arab-American Oil Company, and the Americans have a very similar deal with the Saudis that the British do with the Iranians in regards to oil. The main difference, though, is the American deal is much more, shall we say, fair and equitable compared to the British arrangement with the Iranians, which was fairly extortionate, because the Iranians basically had very little oversight of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and were paid not very much in the profits from the oil that was sold and extracted, whereas the Aramco was known as the 50-50 deal, because the Aramco would give the Saudi government half the sale of the proceeds from oil extracted. And there's an argument to be made, especially by James Barr, the author of the book Lords of the Desert, which is one of the books I've consulted for this stream, is that when looking at the American and British influence in the Middle East, the Americans were concerned about the Iranian coup succeeding because they didn't want to set a pretext for nationalizing oil assets, because they don't want to do is, they've already got a good deal with the Saudis. They don't want to embolden the Saudis to nationalize their own oil assets. So that's also another explanation for why they supported the coup in Iran. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, or?
No, let's continue on.
Okay. And furthermore from there, we've also got, because something I neglected to mention earlier when you had the revolution in 1952 in relation to the Americans is one argument I've seen go around in respect of the whole, America is the reason Britain was defeated in Suez and they betrayed Britain, is these people make this argument, point to the fact that the CIA had contacts with Nasser prior to the revolution, and what this goes down to is the main American agent that's assigned to Egypt is Miles Copeland, who is in direct contact with Nasser. and he basically was aware of the coup 2 days before it happened. I mean, personally, I don't really see that as collaboration. I mean, 2 days isn't much notice. And secondly, why were they maintaining contacts? Well, it's the Cold War. The Americans want to keep good relations with as many countries as possible that are not definite Soviet aligned, and so it's more productive to maintain good relations with a new government rather than isolating and alienating them and possibly driving them towards the Soviets.
Yes, this other book that I'm referencing at the moment, by Keith Kyle, just called Suez, talks about this. The Americans seem to have a better intelligence network in Egypt, but it was still fairly limited. And we only know obviously what's been disclosed and published, and I guess you could take the perspective that it's just lies or made up or something, but that's sort of bizarre, in my opinion. The CIA only had a limited intelligence apparatus in Egypt. The idea that there's a causal relationship between American intelligence agencies and really anything that happened in Egypt at the time is pretty ridiculous. I mean, not to mention the CIA at this time is still fairly new. It's only existed for a few years at this point.
And also, when Miles Copeland, who I mentioned, was one of the founding members, so that just shows you how recent it was. And also to further add to that regarding the CIA, it's also important to not stress the importance of Eisenhower's administration in the change of opinion on the Middle East in terms of supporting British policy, because where I mentioned the coup in Iran, the situation in Iran had actually been boiling over from 1951 to 53, and Truman's administration was actually strongly opposed to supporting a coup in Iran to prop up British support. And it's only when Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers come in that there's actually support for a coup. So, anybody claiming that, Eisenhower or Dulles was hostile to Britain, I think should really reconsider that position in light of that. Is there anything extra you want to come in with?
No, I'm just kind of flipping through this chapter on the CIA's involvement, but we can continue on. I'll bring it up if I find what I'm looking for.
Okay, and it's also interesting because Miles Copeland would maintain this relationship with Nasser for many years, even after the crisis. And what's even more fascinating is that he would even give Nasser, he actually helped Nasser set up the Egypt's own sort of national security intelligence agency. And even allegedly, Copeland would claim in his autobiography that there were concerns that the British might try to assassinate Nasser. And so he basically went on this whole investigative report where he would explore all these different possibilities of Nasser's being assassinated. And there's an argument to be made that it was deliberately made to look like it was very difficult to dissuade any possible assassination attempts, which is a bit of an interesting angle. But again, I don't think it accounts. It just accounts to, I think, trying to maintain good relations with a prospective ally. But you mentioned before the funding of the Aswan Dam. Yes, so this is another aspect that so-called Brits like to say is in fact, this issue we're about to talk about is what is often railroaded as the main cause of Suez, and I don't agree with it. So just to elaborate for the audience, the Aswan Dam, which is this major energy dam that's on the Nile, Nasser wanted to build it to harness energy and to help control the Nile better. And around this time, he's pitching for money from both the West and the Soviets, and both the Americans and the British pledge him money. But ultimately, the British actually withdraw first. The main reason they withdraw is because of the previously mentioned arms deal with Czechoslovakia. But then later the Americans withdraw because they don't like Nasser's flirting with the Soviets, even after offering to fund the canal. And ultimately, the canal is built but with Soviet money and not Western money. And again, okay, you could argue that maybe this pushed Nasser slightly towards the Soviets, but because one of the explanations that's given is because Nasser wasn't given the money to fund the canal, he then, in order to seek money to build not the canal, the dam, sorry, in order to seek the money to build the Aswan Dam, he wants to nationalize the canal so he could then rake in the dividends to fund that project. And okay, I can see the explanation, but my main problem is that it's far too monocausal, because as we've gone over thus far, the Suez Crisis is multifaceted. There are so many more issues playing into it, and I just think it's largely a convenient narrative for anybody who persists with this slap in the back myth.
Yeah, exactly. The events leading up to the nationalization, it's not because of one particular incident that set it off. It's a pattern of events, and it's hard to even say how much the withdrawal of the Aswan Dam offer actually had to do with the nationalization. From reportedly, the meeting with the Egyptian ambassador went fairly well, and there wasn't any sort of explosive outburst or anything like that. Additionally, the Americans and the British more or less tracked in terms of their decision to pursue the offer and then ultimately to withdraw it. And the only real disagreement with the withdrawal between the Americans and the British had to do with the timing and the manner, and not so much the decision itself. And part of that was given that Nasser was flirting with the Soviets and receiving potential money from them, and they had the arms deal with Czechoslovakia. The Western powers were hesitant to fund this dam that would end up basically in the enemy camp if the Egyptians decided to just go full Soviet leaning, right? So then you've just funded this mega project for the Egyptians, and now the Soviets have it. And of course, the project was pursued in the first place. Eden came to the Americans and basically convinced them that they should pursue funding this project because it would basically tying the Egyptians economically to the West would decrease the likelihood that they would switch to the Soviet side if they were dependent on America and Great Britain and the World Bank for this project and potentially future projects.
No, thank you. And another point, to go back to the Dulles brothers, because I was actually, before we went live, I was reading one of the other articles on your Substack. You're reviewing the book Brothers, which is about John Foster Dulles and Alan Dulles, and it's interesting looking at their background because they both worked for the law firm. So was it Sullivan and Cromwell, wasn't it? The name of the firm.
Let me see. The book is by Stephen Kinzer. I forget the publisher.
Yeah. Well. So anywho, the Dulles brothers have a background.
You're talking about the firm that Dulles brothers work for.
Yeah.
Sullivan and Cromwell. That's it.
Yeah. So it's a law firm, but they mostly involve themselves in international commerce, international banking, and one of the annoyances the Americans have towards the British over the crisis is they felt there was an unnecessary escalation because John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, he was already planning a deal whereby the Egyptians would get the canal, but there would be an international treaty ratified by the UN where all nations would have access to travel and use the canal, but the Egyptians would obviously retain a rightful dividends from traffic through the canal, which I think is a pretty sensible policy, but also it lends itself to the worldview of Dulles being from this international banking and finance background. It's almost like an extension of his own worldview and policy. So he was very much annoyed when you had the escalation of this crisis. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, or?
No, I think that about covered it. I mean, that's that whole the Dulles brothers themselves are very interesting figures. Definitely recommend reading that book I reviewed titled The Brothers if you're interested in the founding of the CIA and the history of these two men.
No, thank you. And so the next bit I want to do is I want to go over a lot of the background to how this tripartite alliance between the British, the French, and the Israelis came about. But I just want to address a couple of comments we've had before I do that. So, Nami al-Kazan, Naguib should be pronounced as Naguib. His family name is Najib in Arabic, but the Egyptian dialect is pronounced the J as G. Well, thank you for Nami al-Kazan. Unfortunately, I'm not a native Arab speaker, so I might have to bear that in mind for future. But I need to read more Glub to properly grasp it. Also, Niels Alexander Muller, do you believe the British would have been able to get away with the operation if they had informed the US before? The US had spent a lot of diplomatic power in finding a non-violent solution. Well, as I've just gone over with the this Canal Treaty, Dulles was proposing. Let me read this again. Do you believe the British would have been able to get away with the operation if they had informed? I mean, it's possible. I mean, if it was if it was a longer term sort of negotiation and discussion, possibly. But I think British confidence and trust towards Nasser had been broken. I think partially over the fact that he kept agitating against their influence, and I also think they don't think he was acting in good faith. Whether that's true or not, or whether perception is also up for debate, I think. What's your take, Charlie?
My take is that given the decision to intervene militarily, it was the right thing to do to not inform the Americans and conduct it clandestinely, because the Americans simply never would have gone along with it. And if they had, there was never a point at which the British were going to negotiate with the Americans a military solution. That was simply not going to happen. And I don't think we have any reason to believe that the Americans would have changed sides there, because it seems likely that they would have been to negotiate a deal with Nasser regarding, transit through the canal. I mean, the actual nationalization itself was handled not in a particularly aggressive way, we can say. For example, when the nationalization was declared, the share price was of the previous day is the price at which the Suez company was going to be bought out. So it's not like the assets were just going to be stolen or something like that. It really had to do with control and access to the canal. And I don't really see any reason why Nasser is not someone who could have been negotiated with on that part. But of course, the British believed he was Hitler and Mussolini. So no, I think the British made the right choice, not in deciding to pursue military action, but given that, deciding not to inform the Americans.
And thank you for your input. And it's just to sort of go off from there. Now, while I'm talking about the formation of this tripartite alliance, because around this time, there was this constant comparison between Suez in the minds of the Tories and the 1938 Munich Agreement, where the so-called Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler and peace in our time, and that they're thinking, if we give in to Nasser, we're basically giving in to Hitler. And again, I just think it's the totally delusional understanding of the situation. And now to really get into how this alliance came about. So I've gone over at the beginning what the main goals of the three powers were. And in regards, because also this, like you say in your article, Charlie, that you say that really the French were the linchpin of the alliance between the Israelis and the British. And I think that's very much true, because especially after 1948, Anglo-Israeli relations were not the best, considering the British felt driven out of Palestine by essentially Israeli terrorism, with incidents such as, groups such as Ergun and Lehi, orchestrating incidents such as the King David Hotel bombing. So they very, very, very much saw it as a betrayal by the Israelis, and it only really took a drastic situation with the threat of Nasser and the, I think, linchpin of the French involvement that essentially led to this alliance coming together. And it's sort of interesting to draw a comparison between this and obviously World War One, where you could almost say the entente of the British, the French, and the Russians. The French were really the linchpin of that alliance again, because you have the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894, and then you've got the Entente Cordiale 10 years later in 1904, and then the British and Russians come to a rapprochement in 1907, and then so again you have these two rivals, the British and the Russians, that are essentially brought together by the French as mediators. And it's an interesting role France has played in both these historical events. In regards to the British and French, obviously I've gone over in previous streams with Prudentialist about the history of Anglo-French relations in the Middle East, because they were very fraught, because obviously you've got Sykes-Picot in World War One, where the British and French were going to carve out the Middle East between them. Obviously, the French were eventually strong-armed out of some of their more extensive claims by the British, because largely the British were the ones who were responsible, along the Arabs, for taking that territory from the Turks. Furthermore, because there's also another point I want to talk to you, Charlie, about, is you say in your article there's this idea that the British very much undermined the French, because the French and the Israelis were still happy to keep going when the British stood down on the 6th, and ultimately Britain's withdrawal caused the alliance to collapse and the crisis to end. But it's interesting because when you look at the wider history of the Anglo-French relationship in the Middle East, it almost feels the same. The British are constantly undermining the French, and I largely think this is a difference in how their elite conduct their foreign and colonial affairs. I feel the British are very fox-like. They like to use diplomacy, they like to use intrigue and espionage, and are very underhanded and indirect, whereas the French are much more lion-like. They like to use direct force. So, for example, in 1925 in Syria, there was the Syrian National Revolt, which is this massive uprising against the French, and the French don't try and negotiate or calm the situation down. They just send tens of thousands of French soldiers in to massively escalate the conflict, and as a result, a lot of French and Syrians are killed. And during that conflict, what the British do, they don't support the French. Instead, they try to encourage the French to stand down and negotiate, because they fear the French are, quote unquote, embarrassing the British in the Middle East. And if anything, the British allow Syrian nationalists to shelter in their own territory, therefore subverting France. And again, this would happen 20 years later in the war, because after the British helped the Free French take over Syria and Lebanon, the British are the ones who forced the French to have free elections in Lebanon and Syria. In 1943, a nationalist Lebanese government comes into power under Bashar al-Khoury. Al-Khoury essentially wants to make an amendment to the Lebanese constitution to remove any mention of the mandate, which is a direct slap in the face of the French authority. And what do the French do? They arrest the Lebanese government and install their own pro-French government in Lebanon, and there's a standoff for 9 days. And the French are only forced to back down and are humiliated after the British issued them an ultimatum, forcing them to stand down. And again, in 1945, 2 years later, at the end of the war, when the French were trying to still cling on to Syria, the Syrian government issues to France a notice to leave the country. The French say no. There is a skirmish in the streets of Damascus between the French army and the Syrian army, with the French even bombarding the Syrian parliament building with artillery and planes. And the British have to intervene and then essentially set a curfew where they have to escort the French out of Syria. So again and again and again, it's interesting that the French in Suez, obviously they're trying to shore up their position in Algeria, and they're also trying to shore up their ally Israel, because fundamentally that they'll still rely on the British, despite how perfidious we were to them in the preceding decades. Is there anything you want to come back with at all, or?
Yes, so what you described in terms of how the British and French conducted their foreign policy is even demonstrated in the military planning for the joint operations in Egypt in 1956, where the British were interested in pursuing a more political attack using strategic bombings and psychological warfare in order to politically topple Nasser's regime, where the French strategy pursued destroying the Egyptian military capacity more directly and not making political attacks on Nasser, be it through strategic bombing or radio broadcasts and this sort of thing. So we can see that the French idea is basically simply to destroy the enemy military, and the British are much more interested in using alternative means to remove Nasser from power, even in the military campaign itself. I tend to go with the French perspective on this. I don't think the sort of basically terror bombing type of warfare actually has ever worked at all. Additionally, I mean, I can quote from again this Keith Kyle book here really quick. So he writes, quote, "The special relationship between Britain and the United States never worked so effectively as when it was concerned with excluding the French. They were left out of the 1954 Middle East defense talks, left out of Alpha, left out of the Baghdad Pact, and left out of the High Aswan Dam offer. They had even been left out of the staff talks held in the first half of 1956 on the implementation of the Tripartite Declaration of 1950 itself. Whenever a new policy line was under discussion, the question of whether to ask the French invariably featured high on the agenda. Invariably, the decision was negative. Partly, this was a general verdict on French political and military standing in the Eastern Mediterranean. More specifically, it was because the French were held, especially in the Pentagon, to be insecure, both in the general sense of having a propensity to leak and in the specific sense that, by 1955, the existence of a special link between the French defense establishment and that of Israel had become known. All told, at the beginning of 1956, two more unlikely co-conspirators in the Middle East than Britain and France would have been difficult to find." End quote.
Oh, no, thank you for that quotation there. And from there, I actually want to now talk a little bit about the French-Israel connection, because I mentioned there that the British had spent decades subverting the French influence in the Middle East, because going back to the original Sykes-Picot Treaty, the British and French could not agree over who would get Palestine because they both wanted it, and in the end, in the original agreement, Palestine was going to be an international zone, which neither side was happy with. And it's only later in the war, with the Balfour Declaration, that Britain essentially uses this promise of creating an Israeli state, is what they use to deprive and the French of Palestine and secure it for themselves. And it's just interesting that years later, in response to British attempts to subvert French influence in Lebanon and Syria, during the war, the French had actually aided Israeli and terror incidents against the British, because by this point, actually, the Israelis had become, or Jews had become, very disgruntled towards the British policy in Palestine, because in 1939, just 6 months before the war, there was a massive Palestinian series of riots and uprisings against Jewish settlement. And this resulted in the British Army having to be sent in to defuse the situation. And the 1939 Palestine Roundtable Conference results in Britain having to make a concession to the Arabs by restricting Jewish immigration into Palestine to only 15,000 a year. This incenses a lot of the Jews for obvious reasons. And during the war, especially where you've got a lot of Jews trying to flee the Nazi-occupied Europe, the British are trying to stop Jewish refugees from reaching Palestine. So you've obviously got a very radicalized Jewish population in Palestine that's embittered to what they see as hostile British actions in going against their word of helping enable the creation of a Jewish state. And then what they get as an ally, the French come in covertly, wanting to, one, get revenge on the British for subverting their own influence in Lebanon and Syria, but also through supporting Israel, the French can finally get some influence over Palestine, which they were denied in the original Sykes-Picot carve-up. And this support involves in French sharing intelligence with Israeli terror groups, even sending them supplies and armaments. It even involves allowing Israeli agents to use France as a base of operations to launch bombings into Britain. So this just shows you the length of collaboration between the two. And obviously, after the creation of Israel, the French maintain these arms sales and even military pacts, because in the lead up to Suez, the French even offer their air force to help shield Israel in the event of a war with Egypt, because the Israelis at this time don't have much of an air force, and one of the main concerns of the Israelis was that the Egyptian air force was going to level the country ultimately. And so ultimately, that's the background to the French-Israel connection. And then with the French enacting as the linchpin, so you've got this very, you could say, uneasy alliance between these three parties who are only really working together because there's a mutual benefit. And so to sort of look at the initial sort of plans for what they were going to do. So, well, there's something you mentioned in your article, Charlie, which I've also read into, called the Sèvres Protocol. So this is a meeting between You've got Selwyn Lloyd, the British Foreign Secretary, Christian Pineau, the French Foreign Minister, and then you've got David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli Prime Minister, and then Moshe Dayan, Israel's Chief of Staff, and actually then the main military commander for the Israelis during Suez. They all meet at Sèvres in France over discussing like a joint operation of what they're going to do. And initially, because what would happen is on the 29th of October, the Israelis go in first, and now there was a lot of back and forth between the Israelis and the French and British as to how much ahead the Israelis would go. The British actually wanted Israel to go in as much as a week ahead, and the Israelis were not having this because they knew that if they did so, they would be gravely exposed to the Egyptian Navy and Air Force, and obviously there's a real risk that they'd be fighting the Egyptians on their own, even though they had a very competent and effective army. And furthermore, another thing as well is their concern is that there would be international condemnation obviously leaped on Israel acting alone, and it'd also be seen as the British and French were not really given sufficient support to Israel, and so the Israel insists that the British and French sort of come in and intervene a lot sooner than especially the British would have liked, and obviously eventually agree that the British and French will come in via an ultimatum 24 hours later. So rather than presenting it to the world as a quote, a joint allied invasion of Egypt, instead the Israelis are going to set things off by invading Sinai, and then the British and French are going to come in as the members of the United Nations Security Council. We're going to come in and we're going to stabilize this international crisis by forcing both sides to essentially demilitarize the Suez Canal. And so this is what's agreed at Sèvres. But this does lead to a bit of a embarrassment for Region, because he's still uneasy about how close the British and French are going to go in after the Israelis, because he's trying to maintain top secrecy with the Americans knowing about the operation, because obviously he's concerned that the Jewish lobby in America is going to ensure the Americans are going to come down hard on the British. And that's another interesting aspect of this crisis, is that the French and Israelis openly say during these negotiations that, oh, don't worry about the Americans. The Jewish lobby there will make sure they don't get involved. And it's just amazing how in 1956, American elite were sensible enough to not let themselves just be roped into this foreign incident that was largely as a result of Israeli military action. And 11 years later, when you've got the 6-day war and America is slavishly going along with Israel, despite the fact Israel would obviously attack American ships via the USS Liberty incident, and looking at the current slavish American elite's attitude towards Israel. I mean, do you want to come back with anything on that? Or
yeah, no, it's important to point out here. There's some quote from Eisenhower I can't find, but the Zionist lobby in the United States at this point is not the block of control that it is today. It had influence, but the American decisions in the Suez Crisis were not primarily any result of there was no significant tie to Israel at this time that bound the Americans or the British to doing whatever Israel wanted. So that's important. It's important to point that out here, because there's really no sense in which there was some sort of subversion taking place on the part of Israel in this conflict. Also on what you said about secrecy, I mean, one of the interesting things too is again during the planning, the French wanted to undergo the military preparations very openly, so that Egypt and other parts of the world would see it. And of course, the British were not in agreement with this as well. So throughout the entire operation, until the very moment, the British were pursuing secrecy above all, because I think they understood that they couldn't act. The British rightly understood, Eden in particular, that they couldn't act against American interests, and really what they believed, and it's possible that this is because Eisenhower was up for re-election at the time. This is taking place right around the time of the election, because the war concludes in early November, right?
And just to come in quickly, Eisenhower is actually re-elected the same day the British stand down on Suez, so that was how close it was.
And I think that the British may have believed, and well, it's not just I think, other commenters who were proximate to the events think that the British believe that the American elections would prevent the Americans from acting quickly or strongly against the British, and that they would basically be able to complete the operation fast enough that the U.S. wouldn't be able to respond even if it wanted to. But of course, that turned out to be completely wrong, and the hammer came down hard and fast. But let's not get ahead of ourselves there.
Oh no, certainly. And another point I do need to bring up, this idea of an Israel lobby, because there is an interesting pretext to the Israel lobby affecting American policy. Because obviously, if you go back to election cycles to 1948, the 1948 election of Truman versus Dewey was obviously 6 months after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and Truman was very conscious of that conflict when running for election, because Dewey and the Republicans were running on a very hard line pro-Israel Jewish platform. So this himself forced Truman to adopt a very pro-Israel policy as well. So therefore, this pretext almost made, I think, the Israelis think, the Americans have gone with us before when it's an election year, they'll do it again. But in the words of John Foster Dulles, the tripartite powers were sorely mistaken if they thought the Israel lobby would stop America from doing what they thought was sensible. And okay. And right now we've kind of gone over the background. I now actually want to talk about the actual timeline of the crisis and the actual military preparation. So the original military preparation for Suez was called Operation Musketeer, and this was the brainchild of the British general Charles Keatley. This was actually going to be a lot larger and more grander than the actual invasion. And this was going to be, obviously, the Israelis would still go in first as a spearhead, but then the British and French would then come in with an army of 80,000 men, and they were going to launch a massive amphibious strike on Alexandria. And after Alexandria was taken, there was then a plan to then wage essentially a battle of annihilation on the Egyptian army to the south of Alexandria. So from that perspective, you can obviously see that they did significantly tone down the operation, because you later get Operation Musketeer Revise, or just Revise, where they significantly reduced the Anglo-French military presence down to just some paratroopers and marines that are sent in to attack Port Said, which is the main port of the Suez Canal on the Mediterranean, which is a significantly smaller military target. And why did they change it? Well, largely because in the original plan, they're attacking Alexandria. That's one of Egypt's most major cities. And so obviously there was a concern about causing mass civilian casualties there, especially. And also the problem was because of the time of year, it's autumn, the weather is starting to not be as fair as it had been earlier in the year. And obviously the weather is very important when conducting naval operations, because if we go back to World War II and D-Day, there was a lot of actually bad weather around the time of D-Day. And D-Day actually took place on a day when the weather was actually rather fortuitous, but the other days around it, like the 7th and the 5th of June, it was quite bad and stormy. And it's often believed that if the Operation Overlord had taken place a day or two later, it might have actually failed due to the severe weather. So it's obviously playing on the minds, I think, of the British who are planning this operation. And so I think that's one of the reasons, also one of the other major reasons they abandon Operation Musketeer, because they just think it's too risky. And because obviously of the scale of military involved, obviously that's going to be very difficult to try and hide such mass movements of troops into the area and to keep the whole operation secret.
Right. There were other issues too with this sort of the plan of mass assault, particularly in terms of getting tanks across the Mediterranean into Egypt. So one of the problems is, Britain had withdrawn from Egypt, and then the nationalization happens. And this, of course, is what the Suez Group was warning against in Parliament. So the British would basically have to launch from Cyprus. People are familiar with where Cyprus is. And one of the problems with attacking from Cyprus is the British didn't have piers built there from which that could support tanks to load on the transports for an amphibious assault. People are familiar with landing takes on a beach in 1944 in Normandy, right? You don't just like you need specialized piers to actually load them up on your ships, and these weren't built in Cyprus, so there was a limited capacity in which the British could even deploy armor into Egypt, and this all stems back to leaving Egypt in the first place.
And whilst the other points I've actually neglected to mention, which I've now just remembered, is with regards to Egypt, it's important to remember that for most of Egyptian history in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that Egypt and Sudan were in co-dominion, as in Sudan was like a joint Egyptian-British government, but it was really a British colony held under the guise of an Egyptian co-dominion. But what's important is the previous military treaty the British had allowed them to station forces in Sudan. By 1954, when the British negotiate withdrawing from Suez, the Egyptians and British agreed to grant independence to Sudan. So this is significant because imagine Suez, but with the British having military forces in Sudan. From there, they could have launched an attack from the south, possibly pincering Egypt, and that, I think, could have certainly led to a much more successful outcome. So it was very foresighted of Nasser to ensure that Sudan could not be used as a attack point as well. And furthermore, when I mentioned Jordan trying to distance themselves from the British, it's also important to remember that the Jordan had actually signed a 10-year pact of friendship with the British in 1946. And this meant that Britain was compelled to defend Jordan against military attack. And due to all of the Nasser's subversion of Jordan, the Israelis were considering an actual military attack on Jordan. And especially with the abrogation of the Treaty of Friendship between Jordan and Britain. But it's important that the treaty didn't effectively end until March 1957. So there's actually a small window where Britain was still compelled to defend Jordan. And there's also an argument to say that Britain went along with these tripartite powers of the French and the Israelis because they wanted to direct the Israelis away from invading Jordan and instead towards Egypt, because it would have been obviously much closer to their actual goals and objectives. Because the last thing the British wanted was a situation where Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal and then they can't do anything because they're bogged down helping the Jordanians fight the Israelis off, who are possibly going to be supported by the French. So
yeah, I should also add, you might be able to clarify, I believe from my reading as well, that Great Britain had also just left its bases in Cyprus right before the crisis as well. So they didn't even have those bases present in case they needed to reoccupy Egypt. I don't know if you can confirm that. I can try looking that up really quick.
I'm not that familiar with the British position in Cyprus, so I can't comment on that, sadly. Though
No
Cyprus,
problem.
I will say, though, was a major air base for the RAF in the Middle
Yes.
East. In fact, because I remember reading in Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin that the French and British were considering in 1940 using Cyprus and Syria to bomb the Soviet overfields in Baku. So it just showed you how long range the air bases in Cyprus were. So the British could then very severely pound Egypt with the RAF, and the RAF were essential in ensuring that the Israelis wouldn't get bombed too badly. But just going back to the actual operation, so yes, so as I said, so on the 29th of October is where the crisis begins. Egypt actually Israel launches their invasion of Sinai, and this image I've got up on screen is taken from the Glove book I've been reading from. I tried to look at a lot of different campaign maps for Suez, but I couldn't find any that were to my liking. A lot of them were unclear. This Glove one from the book is actually, I think, the most clear one I found, so I've taken a picture of it, so you can clearly see the Israeli movement. So Israel invades on the 29th of October, and you can see they pretty rapidly take most of the major towns in Sinai. So you can see they take Rafah and Gaza in the first couple of days. They then push through towards the Canal, and in the south you see they also wheeling around to take Sharm el Sheikh and to secure the Straits of Tiran, and then also pushing up as well and dealing with Egyptian armored columns that are being sent their way. And it's on the 4th of November that because on the 30th is when the British and French issued their joint ultimatum for both the Egyptians and the Israelis to effectively stand down, and no party is to advance within 10 miles of the Suez Canal. But the problem with this is this completely gives the game away, because at this point, the Israelis had only just taken Gaza and Rafah and were still many miles from the canal. So by this ultimatum, the British were essentially allowing the Israelis to occupy hundreds of miles of sovereign Egyptian territory, and the Egyptians were supposed to accept that under the guidance of this intervention from the great powers. So this completely gave the game away as to what was going on, and I think ultimately what led to the situation unraveling, I think, diplomatically, because though the invasion was a tactical success, because on the 4th is when the Marines go into Port Said and the paratroopers come in as well, and the city falls the following day. It's actually at that point, it's almost like the high water mark of the crisis for the British, because Eden is elated and thinks they're undefeatable from that point, because they've taken Sinai, they've secured Suez, and they're confident they can hold out for another couple of days, Nasser will fall. But it wasn't to be that way, fundamentally, because there is huge, not only international condemnation on the United Nations and the Americans and the Soviets, but there's also very strong domestic opposition to Eden from the Labour Party, led by the opposition leader. Sorry, I'm forgetting the leader of the Labour opposition leader, but essentially Labour's position is, and main consternation over Suez is that not only were the government trying to be secret towards the Americans, they were also trying to be secret towards the British public and the official opposition. And the Eden is probed over, are the government planning a military intervention in Suez, and should more effort be made to try and negotiate diplomatically? And there's actually kind of leads to Eden's downfall in January 1957 in the aftermath of the crisis, because the pretext for his resignation was the fact that he misled Parliament over Suez, because he tried to deny publicly that there was no invasion that was being planned. Dulles actually around this time chairs a UN meeting in New York, and the UN internationally condemned the invasion, with only the British, French, Israelis, and the Australians and New Zealand going against the resolution to condemn the invasion and order a ceasefire. And then what ends up happening on the 6th of November, when Britain stands down, which leads to the unraveling of the alliance, is, as we mentioned before, Dulles orders that currency reserves of British pound sterling are to be sold on the stock market. And this leads to a lot of economic damage, because from World War II onwards, as a result of the British giving a lot of their gold reserves over to the Americans, and through signing up to a lot of the American financial pacts, such as the Bretton Woods Agreement, the economies of the two are very much tied together. And with this economic influence, they're able to cause a lot of damage. And this damage ultimately results in Eden standing down and the crisis ending. But there is a caveat that I need to bring up, which is not often talked about, which is that though Eden was the Prime Minister, his Chancellor of the Exchequer was Harold Macmillan, the man who would succeed him as Prime Minister. Harold Macmillan is the one who's obviously looking over all of these Treasury reports regarding the sales of the sterling and the economic damage this is causing. Macmillan actually tells a bold-faced lie to Eden. He actually exaggerates the level of economic damage that's being caused by the sale of the currency reserves. The actual damage that had been sustained after only about 2 days was about £30 million, which I'm not saying isn't nothing. But Macmillan claims that the damage is closer to 100 million. So obviously you can see that that is a gross exaggeration of the actual real financial impact. And this ultimately, I think, was significant, because if I think Macmillan had given a more honest assessment, I think it's very possible that Eden's government may have held out another couple of days, which all it could have taken for Nasser to maybe be removed from power or been forced to resign, and the crisis may have actually been a success for the British, French, and Israelis, because they would have got what they wanted out of the crisis, albeit they may have been internationally isolated. Is there anything you want to come back with on that, Charlie, at all? Or
It's difficult to say what a few more days would have bought for the operation. Nasser had plans basically to utilize weapon caches and start basically a people's war, what we would just view as an insurgency now against the British and French and Israeli occupiers. So it's difficult to say what would have happened, whether or not Nasser would have maintained enough popular support for such a thing. But given what we now know of the history of this type of thing in the Middle East, it seems pretty likely that there would have been some sort of insurgency. And imagining the British and the French and the Israelis maintaining against an insurgency, just look at what's happening right now in the Red Sea and the Houthi rebels and everything. Like, imagine if you had like an insurgency along this Suez Canal zone. What could the British and French have done to prevent their shipping from being threatened ultimately? It's hard for me to imagine how now, as international pariahs, basically, how they could have actually defeated any sort of insurgency. So I tend to take the view that even if operations had gone better, they couldn't. There's no way this could have worked out for the British and French. There were a few setbacks early on in the Israeli operations as well that messed with their timeline a bit. I mean, really from the beginning, Operation Kadesh is the Israeli side of things. Like, this involved, you can see on the map in sort of the center on the left there, this paratrooper drop near the Mitlop Pass, and this was done at night. The Israelis like to move at night, but this paradrop missed its target, and there were 400 paratroopers. It was the 202nd Brigade. And they wandered around at night for a few hours and lost some of their vehicles to the desert as well. So right from the beginning, the Israelis were a bit slower than they had supposed to be, and they had other problems as well. Eventually, it only took 3 or 4 days for the Israelis to actually reach the canal. But this timeline, this operation had to go completely smooth and as fast as possible in order to justify the French and British ultimatum. And as you said, it didn't really make any sense given the failure to actually meet the proposed timeline.
I know. Thank you for that. And to further talk about the international situation, especially with Egypt. Obviously, the Egyptians have got tons of Soviet weapons because they've got T-34 tanks and obviously Kalashnikovs. But another point we need to go over is the Soviet perspective in all of this, because the Soviets were prepared to even paradrop in military Soviet soldiers to fight for the Egyptians, which I think would have made the invasion, if it dragged on, much more difficult. And another aspect which we've not really mentioned is Suez was not the only international crisis in 1956, and in fact, it's not the only international crisis that happened during autumn, because almost concurrently you have the Hungarian uprising of 1956, where the communist government of Hungary throws out the Soviets and tries to declare independence, and then Khrushchev sends the tanks in and crushes the uprising on the 4th of November. So that was only 2 days before the British and the Allies stood down. So that just shows you how close of a time frame this all is. So the international tensions were incredibly high during Suez because of this other crisis that was going on. And what's also interesting when you look at Hungary in 1956 is that that was a massive diplomatic faux pas on the Soviets' part, because they become very isolated quite quickly, because communist parties all over the West, which had previously been slavishly pro-Soviet, they become very anti-Soviet like overnight after that invasion, and a lot of them even leave and won't have nothing to do with the communist movement. And so just going to show you how bad PR the Hungarian uprising and the Soviet reaction to it was for leftists internationally. And so this actually comes into Dulles' assessment of the situation and why he wanted to de-escalate and wanted the British to stand down, because the Soviets had just got egg on their face from the uprising and their reaction to it. And his fear is that the Soviets had their backs to the wall, and obviously it could be very dangerous. Again, we talked about them power dropping troops into Egypt, but Dulles was even concerned that the Soviets would actually make good, because they, I think it was Brezhnev, actually wrote a letter to, sorry, not Brezhnev, Khrushchev actually wrote a letter to Eden outright saying that they were prepared to use nuclear weapons to back the Egyptians up. And so, as you can understand, at this time, I think only the US, the Soviets, and the British are the only nuclear armed states in the world at this time. And obviously, a conflict involving all three of these is possibly a recipe for disaster, especially if we're trying to avoid nuclear war. So I think Dulles is, in his assessment, is trying to avoid the situation escalating. And I think, bearing in mind what was going on in Hungary and Soviet threats, is also one of the reasons why he sold off the sterling and tried to pressure the British to back down.
Well, I'll disagree a little bit there, because from what I've read, the Western powers understood that the Soviet threat was basically totally empty, and just it was basically there for diplomatic reasons to take the side of the Egyptians. They knew perfectly well that there would be no nuclear war over the crisis. That said, Dulles's concern was definitely that the Soviets now had egg on their face from having this internal revolution happen and putting it down, and now the Eastern Bloc, Russia, looks really bad for having to put down this rising, right? And now the Soviets can be portrayed as the imperialist power, and the West as the free world, quote unquote. But then you have the British and French engaged in this sort of naked neo-colonialism going on in Egypt, which totally reduces it flips the situation, whereas now the West looks just like the East effectively. So from what I've read, that's really the biggest issue for the West, is that this is occurring at the most inopportune moment in terms of international relations between the first, second, and third world, and the first world pulling more of the third world in its direction. And that's why Eisenhower and Dulles are most furious of all. I don't think there was ever really any indication that they believed that there would be a war with the Soviet Union. It really had to do with, the Americans. The Americans were pursuing a very careful policy of economic integration and dependence in order to bring powers over to their side, and the British were throwing a wrench in that at the worst possible moment.
Certainly, because Suez has to be understood in the context of the Cold War and post-World War II. The Americans and the Soviets are now the superpowers of the world, and though people like to play up this rivalry and hatred, I think that's a little bit overstated. I think there is an element of mutual respect between the two as the two superpowers of the world, and America doesn't want to just needlessly cause international crises to happen, because obviously where they want to maintain soft power and trade as influence to expand their power, they can't do that if they're deciding, allowing their belligerent allies to just go around doing whatever the hell they want, basically.
Right, because as we know now, the American imperial power rests on what we call free trade and open oceans, and the Americans certainly have an interest in the Suez Canal remaining open. The British certainly didn't quite understand this at the time, although maybe they should have, given that the British Empire operated basically the same way. The Americans never would have tolerated a closure of the Suez Canal. So the idea that this operation was necessary in order to keep it open, no matter what Egypt had done, that canal would have been opened, and the Americans certainly would have saw to it.
Oh, it's interesting. Just want to get your opinion, because it's interesting looking at how these different powers, the British, the French, and the Americans, ultimately view foreign policy and their respective empires. There's this concept that's talked about in the history of the British Empire, this idea of informal empire, or countries which you don't directly rule as colonies, but you have influence. So Iran is a prime example of this. Right, the British never really established a formal colony, though there were 2 points where they would invade. So there was a military presence in around 1907 when they had their rapprochement with Russia, and then again they would jointly invade Iran with the Soviets during the Second World War. But the French, in contrast, are much more formal, I would say. The French never really do an informal empire. They want everything to be formalized and official. We are the colonial overlords, and you will listen to us, essentially. The British compromise and try to have formal colonies, but also informal relationships. And then the Americans, I think, are largely the latter, mostly this informal, where everything has to be through a network of sort of trade and diplomacy.
Yeah, well, you can see this conducted in internally in their own law, right? Like French law, Napoleonic code is much different from the English and American common law, which is more a judicially negotiated concept rather than something explicitly codified that has predetermined outcomes without any real discretion from the judiciary. You see this the French conduct their foreign policy and colonialism very directly with military force. The British and a friend Sammy Agog has streamed on this. Like the British have a long history of intelligence agencies and subterfuge. They conduct their imperialism on the basis of diplomacy, with the threat of force behind it ultimately. The Americans do it less diplomatically and more economically, which is, I suppose, maybe a sort of middle space between the British and French methods, where hard economic pressure will be used, backed by military force. I think so. The Americans are much more economy oriented in their empire building, whereas the British are much more diplomacy, like negotiations between all of these disparate factions and setting up deals. And there is an economic component to it, but it has much more to do with the negotiations between all of these different groups rather than direct economic pressure.
No, thank you for your comments on that. And the last two things I want to do before we end the stream is I want to kind of overall assess why did the Suez Crisis ultimately fail for the tripartite powers, and I also want to look at how the failure of the crisis impacted the foreign policies of these various powers. So, why did Suez fail? Well, the short answer could be that ultimately you've got these three powers believe they ultimately could conduct their own invasion of another sovereign country without the consent of the two great superpowers, but I think that's a very simplistic explanation, as I've illustrated with a lot of the history I've shared in the stream. Suez is ultimately, I think, a consequence of a rather dysfunctional colonial policy of the British and French empires and the inability to ultimately work together to each other's benefit. Because as I mentioned, in regards to Sykes-Picot, they were constantly undermining each other, and ultimately Suez only came about, and this Arab nationalist government under Nasser only was strong enough because they themselves had weakened themselves so much through their policies during both world wars and their inability to support each other, to support like a wider imperial project. And I mean, what's your assessment? Do you agree or disagree with that at all? Or
Definitely, the primary actors here are British and France and Israel, sort of a third wheel, and they ended up really most happy with the outcome because they had defeated Egypt militarily, and the fact that a war occurred between them 10 years later, well, they viewed that as a success because they basically bought 10 years. I mean, the problem here is really operational. I would love to get someone like Jimmy Thomas' take on this war, because operationally, the British and French are totally at odds the entire time. The Operation Revise itself ends up being commanded by the British. General Keightley, as you had mentioned earlier, his deputy is Admiral Joubert, a Frenchman, and these two very much disagree. Whereas, Joubert, or Keightley rather, is very much by the book in terms of how the operation should be carried out. This is actually the I should correct myself. The invasion itself was conducted jointly under General Stockwell on the British part and General Beaufort on the French part. So there's the operational side and then the strategic side, and the British were at the head of both of them. And Beaufort wanted to basically, he was more of an opportunist, right? So circumstances on the ground, he wanted to adapt to and exploit, whereas Stockwell was very much committed to the timeline of the existing plan. And so you can kind of see a difference between the French and British perspectives here as well, where the French outlook is, we're using military force and we're going to do whatever it takes in the circumstances to achieve victory, where the British are very cautious and process oriented and don't want to rock the boat in any sense, even while conducting war. So really at no point during the operation itself were the British and French aligned at a command level in terms of what their strategy even was. So, if there was a tighter operational plan between them, I mean, the problem is, like, this entire plan was cooked together in like 3 months. Basically, the British started planning in August, and it's like three or fewer months when this operation has taken place, and by the time it does, even the commanders on the ground aren't really in agreement in terms of how they should proceed. There's no way an operation like that is going to succeed, right? So the only way that this works, even given outcomes like the potential of an insurgency after the fact and the economic pressure, is that the British and French are operationally aligned. And this is the problem with, this problem was addressed in World War II, right, where Eisenhower was given supreme command over the Allied forces, period. The British and French didn't really establish such a clear chain of command. I mean, the British were in charge of the operations, but their objectives were, the way they intended to carry things out were too far apart and contrary to what each party desired. Like the sorry, do you want to respond to that before I continue?
No, and I think that's great. Carry on.
Yeah, so, well, I guess that's really is all there is really to say to it, is that the British and French were operating at cross purposes the entire time, and ultimately you just have the British unilaterally pull out, which is why the French were so angered after the fact. I mean, you can't really imagine something like that couldn't happen under, obviously it's a totally different circumstance, but under Eisenhower's command, you're not just going to have General Montgomery like unilaterally pull out of operations, right? The fact that the British did that really just shows how maybe this is why the French were interested in conducting this more openly, to sort of deny the British the chance to do that. But the fact that the British just unilaterally cease operations, in the midst of victory, I mean, everything had really succeeded, but then economic pressure back home on the home front convinced Eden that, he needed to terminate the operation and cave to American demands. Like, the fact that happened without any discussion with the French, right? There was zero discussion between the British and French before the operation was terminated. The fact that was even possible really shows that what an operational failure this battle was. I mean, at a tactical level, everything really went as best as it possibly could. I mean, this conflict is just interesting from a military perspective too, because during this operation, I think the location was in a stadium, if I recall, but the British conducted the first, helicopter drop in a live fire combat zone during this operation that had never been attempted before, which is interesting to think about. The French over the Suez Canal zone conducted an extremely low altitude paratrooper drop. It was like 300 or 400 feet, something like that, which is incredibly low. And all of these tactical, all parties involved really demonstrated, especially the British and French, high tactical success, but they just had no coherent operational plan. Anyway, I'm just kind of rambling now, but yeah, I'd be interested in hearing a staff officer like Jimmy Thomas or someone with real expertise on this actually comment on it.
No, thank you. That's some great embellishment of the military situation. And yeah, so now to really go over what were the consequences of Suez. Well, for the British, again, I think when looking at the British Empire, I mean, I think everybody would agree that it really effectively ended with World War II. But the British elite, I think, were very dis- were very had this sort of fake reality or illusion that they could keep a pretext of empire going forward into the rest of the 20th century, and Suez very rudely just shatters that illusion. And British influence in internationally, I think, is never the same after Suez. I mean, in the Middle East, they'll keep suffering setbacks. So in 1958 in Iraq, the Ba'ath Party would institute a coup that removes the Hashemite monarchy, so they lose one of their key allies in the Middle East. And then later in 1967, the British are forced out of Aden, which is a port they control in Yemen. They're forced to withdraw because Nasser, buoyed by, because after Suez, Nasser has an absolute explosion in popularity in the Arab world because of this victory over the imperial powers. And as I said before, because he keeps stacking up all these wins, he gets more and more emboldened, and he keeps pumping out that propaganda around the third world. And in Yemen, you've got this sort of revolutionary socialist Yemen Republic that's trying to drive the British out of Aden, and Nasser sends the Egyptian army personnel into Yemen to drive and put more pressure on the British. And eventually I think the willpower to hold on and continue was just gone by 1967, because they do send military forces in to try and hold on to Aden, but that largely backfires on them because of there were just like photos and film of the British military being very rough with the natives, and it kind of just came off looking very bad for them, and they ended up having to pull out ultimately. And then later they do pull out as well of the Gulf states, such as Kuwait and Qatar in the 1970s, 1973 specifically. So you just have this gradual erosion of their influence in the Middle East. And of course, in the years following Suez, the Tory government under Macmillan would eventually decolonize the rest of Africa as well. So so as much as World War II had weakened Britain, Suez, I think, massively accelerates, because I'd argue that much more was decolonized and abandoned post-Suez than between World War II and Suez, because the only really notable one prior was India in 1948.
Right. Suez was really the worst case scenario for Great Britain and Europe. The consequences of Suez are really the most interesting thing, and it's a pivotal battle in the 20th century that isn't really discussed enough. I mean, the reactions to Suez were, basically the British and French went in different directions. I mean, part of the motivation on the part of the French in pursuing this operation was a demonstration that Europe, which France was, the leader of at that time, that Europe could act on its own without the United States. And that's what they were demonstrated. And really, they did successfully demonstrate that. But the problem is their ally was of a different mindset and couldn't take the heat, basically. And, Britain ultimately ended up far more humiliated and subservient than it could have been otherwise if they had more graciously accepted their position. I mean, this is something. The problem with this is this operation is basically just conducted on hubris and cope, basically. And certain politicians, like I reference in my blog, Enoch Powell, for example, was part of the Suez group, but he basically recognized the writing on the wall before everyone else, and kind of understood that Britain was now a second-rate power. And if you just sort of deal with that honestly, perhaps as a second-rate power, you can cooperate with other ones to maintain your interest. But instead, in going directly against the United States and the new international order, they ended up adopting very deliberately a much more subservient role to the United States, because they sort of realized that they had to align with it one-to-one from this point onward, or they were going to be punished. The alternative history, maybe, is that Britain had, more graciously unraveled his empire, and possibly could have kept a lot more of that soft power rather than being displaced by the United States if it hadn't so directly gone against U.S. interests. And, then because of this, the French and British end up diplomatically separated from each other for more than a decade. And there could have been a lot more potential for cooperation between Great Britain and France, had this incident not separated them, because the French rightly felt betrayed by the British. I mean, they really were betrayed, given that the British just unilaterally pulled out of this operation they had agreed to, and this really just completely chilled any possible relationship between Britain and France at this time. France decides to back the Treaty of Rome, and found the European Economic Community, which becomes the European Union. And this was sort of, France basically devoted itself entirely towards Europe, whereas the British went in the other direction towards America. But ultimately, Europe ended up being undermined by the Americans as well, perhaps with the British and French cooperating more closely in an alternate future. Europe could have resisted American subversion more. So, it's what the British and French did, and especially on the British part, they were the real big losers here, was the most counterproductive thing they really could have done. And I guess the question is, like, it's easy to say this in retrospect, but at the time, would it have been possible to recognize this? I think at the very least, some politicians did recognize this, and that's to their credit. And we can judge. Perhaps we can judge the short-sightedness of Eden and the other politicians who decided to go forward with this operation, based mostly on hubris and ego, and also this totally blinkered idea that Nasser was like Hitler, like conducting your foreign policy on the basis that this guy is the next Hitler or something like that, and this is the next Munich, is just totally insane, and it's going to lead you to make insane decisions. And from what we discussed, I mean, it seems like Eden legitimately believed that Nasser was Hitler incarnate, effectively. It doesn't occur to me that was rhetorical flourish on his part, and obviously this is a big problem with policy up to this day. Anyway, I'll hand it back to you now.
Oh, no, thank you for that, Charlotte. Now, going back to France, was it because obviously after Suez, I mentioned that Eden was forced out a couple of months later. Well, Guy Millet, the French Prime Minister, he's also forced out about a year after Suez as well. And in 1958, the French Fourth Republic collapses over the situation in Algeria, which is worsened by their defeat in Suez, because Nasser supports the Algerian independence movement. And obviously, Charles de Gaulle rides back to save the day and founds the presidential French Fifth Republic. So you've got this, obviously, this French former general, de Gaulle, who is obviously leader of the Free French during the war. He's now the head of state of France, and also he's got a government which is much more executive, because the French Fifth Republic is presidential. It's essentially a republican monarchy, if you will, whereas the Fourth Republic had been much more parliamentary. And so you've got a much stronger, more stable government under de Gaulle. And de Gaulle is a man who is very closely had a lot of brushes with the British, because obviously he was leader of Free French during the war, and he was very frustrated by the lack of British support for his Free French initiative, because the British for a time wanted to keep working or try to recognise Vichy before finally recognising de Gaulle. There's also, I mentioned, the British subversion in Lebanon and Syria to drive out French influence, which de Gaulle was annoyed about. And again, ultimately, so you've got de Gaulle, a man who's very bitter towards the British because of the subversion of French interests, coming in now in the aftermath of Suez. And you can really see why he leans and doubles down on this whole idea of, we'll be sovereign in Europe. And again, de Gaulle is also someone who's known for being a bit of an Americophobe, because he sees Britain as his agent of American influence in Europe. And that's why de Gaulle is one of the reasons that Britain doesn't join the EU until the 1970s, because de Gaulle vetoes it while he's still the president of France. So that's certainly another aspect of it. To go over to the Israelis, who you mentioned did the best out of the crisis, they still maintained the occupation of Sinai for about another several months after the conflict, but they do eventually withdraw. The other benefit, I think, is it gave them some more military experience when fighting the Arab powers, and also it did also show the world that for the second time, the Israeli military could actually effectively operate when outgunned, especially with the help of Western aid and powers. And obviously, going on from here, the legacy of Suez is you've then got the other Arab-Israeli conflicts. You've of course got the Six-Day War of 1967, where Israelis and Egyptians under Nasser have a rematch. This time, Nasser doesn't do so well, and kind of gets egg on his face after the Israelis completely humiliate the Arab coalition. And then, of course, you've got the Yom Kippur War in '73 under Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat. And it's interesting because Sadat, being one of the other three officers, does eventually come round to formally recognizing Israel in the '70s before he's assassinated. Is there any assessment you have on Israel at all?
Or not particularly. I would want to add another thing to the French side as well. I mean, part of the French motivation for going into this was the support Nasser was giving Algeria. And of course, at the time, Algeria and Morocco were French departments, which means they're formally, part of France. Sort of like how today, Russia has annexed these parts of the Ukraine, right? They're not just like territories Russia has; they're formally part of Russia from the Russian perspective now, and it's the same case with France. So they had a serious commitment to defending these places. But the irony here is that Nasser, although his regime was supplying some amount of weapons and also moral support to the situation in French North Africa, it was actually really very little, and there was really no reason for the French to assault Nasser in order to protect Algeria, and ultimately it ended up being completely counterproductive there. Whereas perhaps without this failure, maybe the outcome in French North Africa could have been different. So they really shot themselves in the foot here, effectively based on not actual intelligence, but simply a totally wrong read of the situation between Nasser and the Algerians.
Oh no, certainly. And so one point of correction I want to bring up is only the coastal departments of Algeria were part of France, and Morocco was a protectorate, so nominally an autonomous government, but under significant French influence, as was Tunisia.
Ah, okay, I see.
Yeah, but yes, that's why they were so doggedly did not want Algerian independence, because it was governed as part of France. They were French citizens living there, and obviously they wanted to protect their colonial legacy. So other than that, is there any sort of final comments you want to make on Suez or its legacy at all? Or
well, it's really the breaking point of European power. We understand that after World War II, Europe was defeated and prostrate, basically, and the American influence started, being the dominant force. But without the Suez Crisis, it's possible that there was an alternative, less humiliating future for Europe where they weren't so completely dominated by the U.S. The U.S. influence still would have been primary, but perhaps that is something that could have been more gracefully ridden out. I mean, we're starting to see American influence decline today. I think it's inevitable that American influence increased in power over Europe during the Cold War, but it's possible that Europe could have been in a much better position today to sort of buck that influence, especially with greater cooperation between Britain and France. I mean, the real key takeaway here, again, is that this crisis separated Britain and France more or less permanently, and Britain very consciously took a much more cooperative, and you can really say subservient role to American power, and France went very explicitly in the other direction. So any potential there really was after the Second World War for Europe to sort of rebuild its own independent domestic and foreign policy sans American influence in the long run dissolved here.
No, certainly. And another point, I just want to engage in a little bit of counterfactual history, but it's interesting seeing that obviously with the British government under Eden being the Tories in power, and just how perpetually throughout modern British history they have this talent for just making an absolute mess of things as they do. It's interesting because obviously before the Tories came in '51, you had the post-war Labour government for 45 to 51, and despite Labour having this there's this idea that Labour are these like rabid anti-colonialists, and okay, there's some merit to that because obviously it was largely Labour that oversaw the decolonisation of India, but Labour did keep most of the rest of the British Empire intact, and in fact, this is largely the credit of the foreign minister who was in office for most of that 45 to 51 government, which was Ernest Bevin. So he, I think, because he came from this very working class background, he was formerly a miner. I think he had a much more practical view of things. He didn't have like these pie in the sky Tory conceptions of world power or diplomacy, and so when he kind of got in, he listened to a lot of the civil servants and like Whitehall officials about the British foreign position and colonial position, and he listened to them and implemented it in because ultimately the decolonisation of India, I think, was a necessity because it was costing far too much to keep going. So I understand why they had to let it go, but Labour still, I think, and especially Bevin, understood the need to maintain British power in as much of the world as they could, and and obviously during the crisis, Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the Labour Party, was very critical of the Tories' government over Suez, and I have to wonder if Labour under Gaitskell were in power, I think they possibly would have avoided this crisis and probably dealt with it a lot more sensibly.
It's certainly possible. I mean, one thing we can say too, and I suppose this is to the credit of Labour, is they didn't exploit this crisis at all to overturn the Conservatives. I mean, the Tories even won more seats in the election of 59. So, one might think that this would be a golden opportunity to exploit party politics, but no, although Eden was out, and I think Macmillan was the next prime minister, is that correct?
Yes, Macmillan comes in, and maybe we could argue, remember, because Macmillan was, I think, one of the chief people on the British side that forced them to stand down because he was the one saying to Eden, look, we can't keep going with all this economic damage. And so, I don't know, perhaps there is an element of the public seeing him as a more sensible pair of hands. And it's also important to remember that most of the British public were opposed to the involvement in Suez. And so the Tories literally went against their own voters, as they consistently do.
Yeah, this is interesting too, because domestically, I mean, France was in a different situation where the French Parliament and the country was basically totally behind the French involvement here. Whereas, I mean, this is one of the great mistakes on the part of the British is going against their own public, right? I mean, they really, Eden's government had no mandate or real means to get away with this at all. It was just this sort of moonshot that they decided to fire, whereas the French actually had real backing for this thing in their government and in their country. So again, it's a completely bizarre and hubris-filled decision for Eden to have pursued this particular policy, because there's really no conceivable means by which you could really believe it would succeed.
No, certainly. Again, it's just this sort of Tory like pie in the sky thinking, a legacy of Churchill's view towards the Germans in the Second World War. And I also, again, this illusion that you're still an imperial power. Like it's 1956, not 1856. You just can't go around executing gunboat diplomacy, a la the Opium Wars or the British invasion of Zanzibar in 1898. That you just can't turn up with your fleet and just bomb a country and attack it, or even the original British occupation in 1882. You just can't turn up like that and just shell the place.
No, I mean, it could be noted too that Eden had very limited experience in terms of governing. I mean, especially domestically, he was foreign secretary for, I don't know, I'm sure you know how many years, but he hadn't served in any other ministerial position in a cabinet as far as I know. And perhaps he had a very limited view of what Great Britain could actually do, because he spent all of his time in this one very specialized role and didn't really see the full picture very well.
Well, ultimately, I think it's the fact that he was Churchill's creature, and so he made all the Churchill's mistakes.
Yeah, I suppose so. As we understand, Churchill ultimately, it seems, was actually for intervention as well.
Mm. That would have been interesting because Eden only really came in as prime minister because Churchill suffers a stroke in 1955, so he retires from politics. So I have to wonder if Churchill had carried on in office a bit longer, where we would have seen a Suez Crisis with him at the helm. Perhaps that may have shattered a lot of people's sort of mythology of Churchill, this great leader.
Yeah, I don't know, but no,
Certainly,
I think we've
certainly.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's certainly interesting to think about. But yes, I think we've been going for 2.5 hours, and I think we've exhausted everything we can out of this conversation. So, thank you very much for taking part of this, Charlie. This has been a wonderful discussion. So, is there anything you want to share before we get out of here?
Yeah, well, primarily what instigated this is my blog post on my blog NeoReactor, which is at charlemagne.substack.com. I do my paid posts are these book reviews. This one was more of a multi-book research project, but you can go read the free preview if you're a free subscriber. A lot of the reason I do these is just to encourage people to pick up books on topics. I mean, I basically review books that I think are worth reading. Um, and if not, you can get sort of the footnotes in my version of things. Also, obviously, check out the Old Glory Club, which is an organization I helped found. If you're an American, so you can go to theoldgloryclub.com. We're a fraternal organization that has chapters in many states now. We'll soon be up to 10 states in the union if the next couple chapters are approved and get their stuff together. So that's all I've got. Oh yeah, also you could check us out on YouTube, the Old Glory Club. We do weekly streams on Thursdays, and of course we have our own Substack as well, which you could find on the website.
No, thank you, Charlie, and I concur. Everybody watching should watch the Old Glory Club because they are a wonderful group of fine gentlemen, including yourself, Charlie, and many others who have had on my channel. I've had Prudentialist on, I've had Red Hawk on, I've had Hunger on. So you're all great guys and you're doing good work. In terms of this channel, no stream next week, but the week after, on the 24th of August, you'll see the return of Todd Lewis, Praise of Folly. He and I will be discussing the life and legacy of Scipio Africanus. Todd's has made a bold claim that he thinks Scipio is the greatest military commander of all time, and we're going to be looking at the veracity of that claim because after what I've read of Scipio, I'm starting to agree with that. So thank you all for watching, and good night.